Good evening and welcome everybody. People are still arriving. I'm going to give people just like another minute before I kick off. I'm delighted to see so many of you here at the first meeting of the National Jewish Assembly, which is being held via Zoom. We have three excellent guest speakers this evening. We have Baroness Ruth Deech, then we have Dov Lipman, who's a former member of the Knesset, and then we have the Conservative MP for Hendon, Matthew Offord. I'm just going to wait just a few more moments as people are still coming in thick and fast, and then I will kick off with my session. Okay. Now they're still coming in. We're at 31 so far, and we have over 60 people registered, nearly 70 people registered actually, so people are probably going to be coming in the next few minutes. Anyway, as it's now time, I'm going to start. I want to just give you a report on how the National Jewish Assembly is doing to date. We kicked off almost exactly 2 months ago. Our first member joined, I think it was on the evening of April 27th at 7 in the evening. We now have approximately 190 members. I was hoping we'd get to 200 by tonight, but alas, it isn't to be, but I hope we will do that very, very soon. The vast majority of those are people who paid £30 as individuals or £50 as couples, but we are starting to talk to organisations and shuls. One shul has joined and subscribed 11 members, another shul is about to join and is talking of subscribing 17 members. So our numbers should go up. My target is 500 members by the end of the first year. I think it's fair to say that in terms of the way we're structuring the entity, it's a lot more like a political party. You know, you pay your £25 or £30 a year for a subscription, and what do you get for your money? You get invited to lots of meetings like this. Some will be face-to-face, many of them will be on Zoom. You get invited to assembly-style meetings where you'll have the opportunity to give your points of view and debate political motions. You'll get invited in the fullness of time to vote in elections. And then after a year, you'll be asked to pay another £25 or £30. So it's very similar to the way the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democrats, etc., are all structured. In terms of what we've been doing, we have also got an advisory board, which is all on our website. Our website's fairly comprehensive in terms of activities. There are 11 members of the advisory board, and they're all people who've agreed to give a few hours a week of their time to helping in what we're trying to achieve. The first thing we're trying to achieve is boost membership, of course. And I'm delighted that Karen Solomon, one of our advisory members, has taken on the membership committee. We are going to have 4 further committees in the near future. I'll be writing to all members about them in probably a week or so from now. One will be on the subject of Israel, which Steve Winston, my vice chair, will be leading. One will be on the subject of Jewish life, which Rabbi David Neifeld, who's another advisory board member, will be leading. And 2 of them are anti-Semitism related. One, Lawrence Julius, will lead, and the other will be led by Johnny Taylor. And I'll be writing to you about these committees and inviting anyone who's a member of the NJA to join probably about a week from now. The other main achievement we've done is we have affiliated ourselves to an organisation called the European Jewish Association. Some of you have heard of the European Jewish Congress, but not the European Jewish Association. Both are Europe-wide bodies. The EJC only comprises one major Jewish organisation per country, whereas the EJA comprises 4 or 5 organisations in many countries. And James Muller and I had the pleasure and the honour of representing the NJA. It's a fantastic conference in Budapest. It's been written up in the newspapers last week. We also are in the very, very early stages of talking to other organisations around the world. The Zionist Organization of America have asked me if we would like to advertise one of their events. And as it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon New York time, it'll be 6 in the evening here. I don't see why I shouldn't, because somebody may want to go to it. And also another organisation, the other side of the world, the Australia Jewish Association, we're also talking to them. In the long run, what is our plan? Our plan is eventually to gain some form of political influence and hope that the objectives that we set out so clearly on our website can be achieved. It will take time. And I think the first strategy is to build up the membership, make sure all you, the members, are happy with lots of events, so you can't complain you're not getting value for money, and then we'll work from there. Now, I'm happy to take questions. Anyone want to ask me a question? If you put up your, I think there's this, Dahlia, I think there's a blue hand that they can put up. Where is it? It's in reactions. If you go to reactions somewhere, you can raise your hand. Does anyone want to raise their hand and ask me a question? I don't see any hands up at the moment at all. I do see there's still some people in the waiting room, so they could be let in. Okay, no one wants to ask me. If nobody wants to ask me any questions, please, I will now proceed and introduce Baroness Ruth Deech. Last chance for questions. No? Okay. It gives me very great pleasure then to introduce Baroness Ruth Deech as our first guest speaker via Zoom of the National Jewish Assembly. She will, I hope, be the first of very many. We have 3 tonight, and we're planning to have 3 ideally each time we meet via Zoom, and I'm hoping that will be every 4 to 6 weeks. Baroness Deech graduated from St Anne's College, Oxford, getting a first in law, which is a fantastic achievement, and then spent 20 years as a law tutor and lecturer at St Anne's College, Oxford, where she graduated. She also spent 4 years serving as the independent adjudicator for higher education, which means she was the person people would come to with their complaints about things going on at universities, which are pretty, I think she did that between 2004 and 2008. And I should think that today it's probably lots of them at the moment, even more than there were then. She was elevated to the House of Lords in 2005 as Baroness Deech Cumnor. She still serves as president of law at Gresham College in London. And for me, the most important of her achievements is that she's one of my predecessors as director and trustee of JNF UK, which is obviously a fantastic charity. But I would say that, wouldn't I? And finally, and most impressively at the moment, she is a patron of UK Lawyers for Israel, which is a splendid organisation. I'm delighted that several of the key people at UK Lawyers for Israel are actually members of the National Jewish Assembly. So now I'm going to hand over to James Marlowe, who is going to conduct the interview with Baroness Deech. James.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And it is a great pleasure to be hosting this very first National Jewish Assembly Zoom meeting. Now, in 2013, the then Prime Minister David Cameron proposed a Holocaust Memorial and Educational Centre to be built in the heart of Westminster at a cost of more than £100 million. It quickly received a great deal of cross-party support in the House of Commons and in the Lords, and the Board of Deputies welcomed the decision. However, there was those who actually opposed. They included Westminster City Council, local community groups, some Jewish leaders, and even some Holocaust survivors. Another one who spoke out against the memorial site is Baroness Ruth Deech, and I'm really happy that she joins me now, virtually, of course, in these days of the 21st century. Good evening, Baroness Deech.
Good evening. I'm very pleased to be with you, and I hope that you achieve all your objectives.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Now, the High Court quashed the decision to build the development in Victoria Tower Gardens. For those who don't know where that is, it's a small park next to Westminster Abbey and the Palace of Westminster. Some have said that it's the right idea, but it's the wrong time. Would you agree with that?
It's certainly the wrong location. Whether it's the right idea depends on what Jewish people expect and need from a Holocaust Memorial. Now, let me say, first of all, that I think I know what I'm talking about. And I'm feeling very grievously upset for the memory of those of my family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins who died. My father was a refugee who arrived in 1939. My mother lost her mother in a concentration camp. And as a very young child, I think when other children were getting stories about Peter Rabbit and so on, I was getting stories from my parents about what was happening, what had happened in Europe, what their villages were like, and they were devastated over the deaths. So for me, and probably many of those listening, almost every day is Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I'm upset about this new venture because it is neither about the Holocaust, nor is it a memorial. It's driven largely by people who one would not call experts on the Holocaust. Eric Pickles, Ed Balls, Dido Harding of Test and Trace fame, Natasha Kaplinsky, Mona Siddiqui. And they're doing it for reasons that really have very little to do with the Jewish community. The theme of the so-called Learning Centre, which incidentally is just 4 small underground rooms, is British values. In sum, what they're trying to put forward is that if you subscribe to British values, democracy, the rule of law, and so on, there can be no genocide. Now, that is actually a historically flawed argument. And it resonates a bit with what they're doing in Eastern Europe. Many Eastern Europe countries have built and are building Holocaust memorials, which have a slant on them. Look, it wasn't us Hungarians, for example, who did these terrible things. It was the Nazis. We were brave resistors. You get a lot of that kind of thing. And if you study, and I fear most people haven't, the theme of the content of the memorial plan for Westminster, it's all about that was in the past, nothing to do with us, can't happen here. But more than that, it's a sort of flag waving. We are not Corbyn. That was then, it's not now. And more than that, it's going to commemorate not just our Holocaust, but Roma, Rwanda, LGBT, and so on. And once you do that, tragic though those other genocides equally are, you start to dilute the message. And the message is, and should be, one of Jew hatred, going back not just 2,000 years, 4,000, 5,000 years. And that needs to be examined. And if I can go on a bit, what started me on my quite impassioned objection was going to large Holocaust Remembrance Day commemorations in London. And who do I see in the front row? Jeremy Corbyn. And in Parliament once a year, there's Holocaust Remembrance Day, and MPs and peers queue up to sign a blank book. And they have their photos taken by a professional photographer who says it's for their constituencies. They sign a book, never again. And who do I see? Jeremy Corbyn and Baroness Tong. I haven't got time to go into that, but she is of the same ilk. And suddenly it dawned on me. It's so easy, isn't it? And useful to say, terribly, terribly sorry about 6 million dead Jews. Never again. Look at me, I'm not a racist. I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm terribly sorry. And then you can go out and start attacking Israel existentially and today's Jews. And in all the Holocaust remembrance functions that we see around the world, there is this missing link between what happened then and today's anti-Semitism, which, as you all know, centers very largely on Israel. Jonathan Sachs did not support this memorial. He said, and I wholly agree, the Holocaust must be taught in context. What was it? What life was it that the Nazis set out to destroy, and why? And what happened afterwards? And how come that the British, of all people, kept the gates of Palestine closed in the 1930s? Think how many hundreds of thousands or even millions could have been saved if those gates had been opened. My father arrived, as I said, in 1939. He was interned, and then they tried to deport him on a ship that was sunk, and luckily he just didn't show up. But he was stateless, and because my mother married him, she became stateless as well. And again, think about the kinder transport, which I'm sure will be very much celebrated in this memorial if they build it. Yes, the kinder transport. But where were the parents? They weren't allowed to come. And if you read the Whitehall documents about the kinder transport, the feeling was in Whitehall that the children were young enough to be anglicised, but the parents weren't. And the children had to be paid for by people here. So the British story is not an altogether happy one. I'm not sure whether it will be explored. But it seems to me that this runs the danger of being something of a whitewash job. And then I'll stop in a minute. There are already, depending on how you count them, 7 or 12 or maybe more Holocaust memorials in this country. In Nottinghamshire, in the Imperial War Museum, in Huddersfield. They're collecting money to build one in Harwich. At Liverpool Street, the Imperial War Museum, of course. No one has ever said, what impact do they have? Around the world, there are more than 300 Holocaust memorials. Holocaust education is compulsory in our schools for teenagers. Those same teenagers, a few years later, go on to university, whereas I know some of them attack Jews. You've all read about the youths in Oxford Street who attacked a bus full of Chabad kids celebrating Purim. You've all read, I'm sure, about the youths who drove through North London shouting obscenities in a densely Jewish populated area. You've all read about the attacks on Jews in Stamford Hill and so on. Those people had Holocaust education at school. They have lived in a country where there are 6 or 12 Holocaust memorials. Has it done any good? I'm now very concerned about the impact of Holocaust education, because if it doesn't teach young people about Jews today and Israel, is it doing its job? And if young people who may never have met a Jew go to a Holocaust memorial and all they see is pictures of piles of dead bodies, striped uniforms, people with their hands up, people clinging to electrified fences, is that all they're ever going to know about us? I think that's the wrong picture for them to take away. I'll stop there. But
that's a very, very comprehensive answer.
Why I'm worried.
Yeah, and the reason why I allowed you to talk for so long, because 3 or 4 of my colleagues have actually said that they were for it. And once they heard you speak, they suddenly changed their minds. And that's why I was very interested to hear what you said. But what would you do with the £100 million that is being offered? How would you educate them?
100 million isn't being offered. 75 million was offered by the government.
Plus the 25 million.
Spent. The cost is now likely to be nearer 200 million than 1. How is it going to be raised, and at what cost to our existing Jewish charities? I'll tell you what I think should be done with it. If you go back to the Prime Minister's Holocaust Commission, the only one of its recommendations that has been carried out is building a memorial. They also said there should be an overhaul of Holocaust education. There should be a campus where all the Jewish educational offices could come together, a lecture hall, a quiet space for prayer, and work on spreading Holocaust and Jewish education around the country, and a professorship. None of those things have even been started on. All the money is going into the memorial. And there are problems, because if you build it on the patch of green where they want to build it, it's as close to the river. It's a matter of inches away from the River Thames. And it's on a slope. No one has mentioned the word rain. I've gone through all the architectural buildings. Rain. What happens when it rains? The entrance is sloping and uncovered. There is no exit. If there was a flood, heaven forbid, they're really stuck. There's only one entrance and no exit. It's going to cost a fortune to make it secure, if it can be made secure at all. And although this should never stop one building, think of the provocation it will offer to vandals because of where it is.
Right, I was going to ask you, because some say that if you give in to what some are being described as anti-Semites and those who just wish to whitewash the history of the Holocaust and move on, what type of a message does that send to those people?
Now, I must just say the use of the word anti-Semite in this debate has been debased. Even I, for opposing it, have been called an anti-Semite. Me? Every time someone opposes it, they're called an anti-Semite. This is simply not the case. Now, of course, the prospect of vandalism shouldn't stop you building. But I've now looked at, either myself or in pictures, Holocaust memorials all around the world. And I've looked at those that are vandalized and those that aren't. The ones that get vandalized on the whole are the abstract ones, the lumps of concrete, the pillars and so on, because they don't mean anything to anybody. Some of you may have been to Berlin and seen that city block covered in sort of lumps of concrete. People don't know what it's about. They have picnics on top, they dance around, they play games. Yes. The ones that don't get vandalized are the ones that show you actual people. For example, at Liverpool Street or around the world, there are memorials showing, for example, children's shoes and actual people. They tend to be respected. And also this particular one, because it will also be about LGBT and Roma and so on, it's going to attract, possibly, opposition in relation to all of those things. And recently, in recent years, we've seen just how many demos there are in Westminster and the trouble that can be caused. And I have a feeling, although it shouldn't put you off, Rent a Mob will be there in no time, I'm afraid, because of the way it looks. It looks like a giant toast rack, frankly, or the rib of a dinosaur. It has no meaning to it at all. You would never walk past it and think, oh, Holocaust.
So let me just ask you this then. Let's say that the government still has 50 million left. Would you support an idea of sending a number of scores off to Auschwitz or with a educational Holocaust, educational on the Holocaust beforehand?
People go to Auschwitz already. There's March of the Living. I'll tell you what I would do. I would have a small memorial, but it would have to be graphic, and I would want it surrounded by flowers, and I would want it a place where you could pray with names. This one is not going to commemorate anyone. And then I would spend the rest of the money on completely overhauling Holocaust education to make it into Jewish history education. Just as Black people have Black History Month, I would want Jewish history to be taught. And I would digitalize all the material that's in the Imperial War Museum and everywhere else, Jewish Museum, and make that available to schools all around the country. Instead of dragging children down to London, which is a difficult venture, I would digitalize it all so you can send it out all over the country. But I think the main thing is to have a proper Jewish education syllabus, not just a Holocaust education syllabus. If you want to see what I mean, go to Warsaw. Ironically, in Poland, of all places, there is a magnificent museum called Poland, History of the Jewish People in Poland. And it's wonderful. It covers everything for the last 1,000 years, going up to the Holocaust and beyond, and it pulls no punches. That's the way to do it. Teach children the history, and we're still here. Tell them we're here. Tell them why we need Israel. One of the lectures I gave like this, somebody came on screen and said that she learned about Jewish people in the Bible. She wasn't Jewish. She didn't know they still existed. There must be more people like that out there. Tell them about us now. Not just the Holocaust, not just we're dead and victims. Now, a living people with a history who made contributions to mankind beyond anything you could imagine and picked themselves up after the Holocaust, established Israel, and were still here. And we have something to offer. And anti-Semitism is not a failure of democracy, which is what this memorial is putting forward, or a failure of British values. It's rooted in 1,000 years of Christian teaching, more than that. And before that, other people as well. That they have got to know.
Fascinating. You mentioned Warsaw. My grandmother came from Warsaw, and had she not got out before the war, of course, I would not be speaking with you right now. Let me move on to despite you being called an anti-Semite, let me move on to the fact that you're a well-known fighter against anti-Semitism and a staunch supporter of the State of Israel. Firstly, on this, where do you think the rise of anti-Semitism is coming from, and what's driving it in this country?
Well, that's a difficult question. And if I had 100 million, I'd be spending part of it on that. I'm afraid it comes from not having dealt properly with the past. You could say that Germany and other countries have dealt with the Holocaust. We have not dealt with the past history of anti-Semitism. As Jonathan Sachs said, it used to be religious and then it was racial and now it's Israel. We haven't dealt with it. We haven't spoken about it. We haven't joined up the dotted lines. And secondly, I'm afraid it comes not only from the extreme right, as it always has done, but also from the Islamists. And I'm very concerned that a disproportionate number of attacks on Jews, according to the CST statistics, are coming from people who identify or appear to be Muslims. And I think that too is a failure of education. Children at schools should be taught about the Jews, just as children in Jewish schools, I hope, are taught about Christianity. We should be taught all the religions, and there should be a concerted effort to face up to this and say anti-Semitism is not just something that happened in the Second World War because of the Germans. It's still with us now. And Israel has a history of thousands of years. It is the only safe haven in the world for Jewish people when anti-Semitism is on the rise.
It's interesting how you said the far right and the Islamists, which of course everyone would agree, but you didn't say the far left, right? And
the far left too, of course.
I was going to say, of course you would say that, and I was going to say, isn't it ironic that in the early 70s, and we're probably old enough to remember the Harold Wilson government, although I was a little boy at the time, that Harold Wilson and his Socialist Party identified very much with the Labour Party in Israel. Harold Wilson and Golda Meir were good friends. They met on a regular basis. It was Edward Heath's government that prevented planes coming from America flying over British airspace to Israel during the 1973 war. What has changed over the years for it to literally flip-flop?
Identity politics, I'm afraid. This notion, which is growing all the time, that people are victims. Everyone finds a way in which they are a victim and they identify with a particular group. And Jews, I'm afraid, ever since 1967, are seen as victors, are seen as white, are seen as privileged, are seen as wealthy, are seen as settlers. And I think the Islamists have carefully repackaged us to look like white empire builders. That's the trouble on the left. And it hasn't gone away. I was a bit disappointed to see the chief rabbi sitting down for a chat with Sir Keir Starmer. I think it's a bit premature. I'm not sure, although Keir Starmer clearly means well, I'm not sure that there has been a thorough rooting out of anti-Semitism in the party. And it's got to focus on Israel, because too many people, as you well know, describe themselves as anti-Zionists, and we know perfectly well what they mean. I'd like to see Sir Keir Starmer go on a visit to Israel. That would be nice.
I was actually going to come on to that as well, because whether you felt that Sir Keir Starmer has done enough within his party, certainly there are supporters that still are very much anti-Israel. You see this on the tweets and the Facebook posts all the time. I mean, have you personally experienced anti-Semitism in the House of Lords?
Well, I had it at school, and then I led a blissfully happy life. And when I got into the House of Lords, it really didn't occur to me that I would come up against it. And there it is in the form of anti-Zionism, of course. The House of Lords is really rather obsessed with this. If you have a debate on children, someone will say, what about Palestinian children? If you have a debate on procurement and trade disputes, it'll be, we mustn't buy Israeli goods. And I think some of the most upsetting things I've heard have been in relation to debates about Palestine, in which there are a lot. You Jews, it was done to you. You should have learned the lesson. To which I say, it's the perpetrators who need to learn the lesson, not the victims. And the word Holocaust is used too trivially. That's another reason for perhaps not having another Holocaust. It's always a Holocaust of animals, a Holocaust of refugees, a Holocaust. Holocaust has come to mean awful. It's been almost denuded of its proper meaning, and that's bad. And in the House of Lords, I'm afraid, there's usually one bishop who goes out of his way to attack Israel, and usually a Lib Dem as well. And one of the ways they do it is every day there's a sort of daily magazine called the House of Lords Business. And any of us can put down and are printed in that magazine questions which we're putting to the government for answer. The answers, unfortunately, aren't printed there, so people very rarely see the answers. They see the questions, and a typical question from a couple of the Lib Dems I'm thinking of would be go something like this: to ask Her Majesty's government what representations they have made to the Israeli government about the alleged kidnapping and torture of a Palestinian child. They say alleged, so that if it turns out not to be true, which of course it isn't, they say, oh, I thought it was true. I saw it in Al Jazeera or something. They get their information from Islamist media. That's the kind of thing. Or endless drip about Christians are dwindling in the Holy Land. The dog whistle is Israel is persecuting Christians. We all know, this audience knows, of course, that Israel is the only place in the Middle East where the number of Christians is rising, where they can lead a fully Christian life. But they never stop, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, whom we took to task about this. Christians are dwindling in the Holy Land. And he got quite upset when we took him to task over that. I said, you know what message that is putting across? He said, I don't mean that, I mean the Holy Land, whatever that is.
Let's talk about, you mentioned Al Jazeera there, you referenced Al Jazeera. So let's talk about Shirin Abu Akleh. She is the Al Jazeera journalist tragically shot dead by, well, we don't know. But Al Jazeera do, and CNN do, and the BBC does, and the New York Times and the United Nations, the list goes on and on. You've spoken before at the United Nations Watch. In fact, I watched the video, which was on YouTube yesterday. To say that the United Nations has lost its purpose, would that be right in saying? And how do you replace it? Or is it just the ridiculous Human Rights Council that has just gone completely off the road into the fields and crashed?
Well, I'm very disappointed because I taught international law when I was teaching. I taught it from 1970 onwards, and the UN did seem then like a beacon. But the trouble is, of course, it consists of about 147 states, most of whom, the great majority of whom, are not themselves democracies. And they're allowed to vote when they don't let their own population vote. And one convenient way of covering up your own shortcomings in democracy and human rights is to point the finger at somebody else. And it is absolutely appalling the way that Israel is always on the agenda of the United Nations Human Rights Commission, compared with China. I need hardly go on, compared with Russia. By the way, do you ever see students persecuting fellow Chinese students or Russian students? No, of course you don't. Have you seen them taking to the streets to march and protest? No, of course you haven't. So in that sense, I do feel the UN has lost its way and it's something of a waste of money. And I found the Durban conference, where they built on the Zionism is racism resolution and its successors, a terrible waste of money and deeply disappointing. And as far as the shooting of that journalist goes, we don't know. Even if the bullet is handed over, who knows what bullet it is? You know, it could be any bullet. And I Googled recently, and I found that several other journalists were killed in the same period of time, in the same week or so. I can't remember their names, and you probably can't either. I'm sure you don't know them. But the world focused on just that one journalist, only that one, and others were killed. I hope it's not Israel. And even if it was, it's bound to be unintentional. I mean, there's no earthly reason why Israel would target that journalist. but we'll probably never know, because even if a bullet is handed over, who knows what's been done to it by the time it's been handed over, or whether it's the right bullet. But it's just another stick with which to beat Israel, and very convenient for the UN and the BBC and the New York Times and all the rest of them.
And it's still very much in the news. I mean, for the BBC to actually have the confidence to say the Israelis actually shot her dead is really going beyond the level that the border that they used to go to. Let me move on, because you mentioned as well the Liberal Democrats in the House of Lords. I wanted to pick up on a Liberal Democrat MP in the House of Commons. Her name is Leila Moran, and she has a private members bill going through Parliament. It's currently at its second reading right now. For those who don't know, it still has to go to the committee stage and then the report stage and the third reading before it goes to the House of Lords, where of course you sit. The bill is actually to recognize the state of Palestine. Do you think that some MPs continually push for this in the House of Commons, not because they believe it's going to enhance peace in the Middle East and enhance peace between the Palestinian Arabs and Israelis, but literally just to stick it to the pro-Israel members or the pro-Israel campaigners?
Fortunately, this government is pretty good on Israel matters. I've dealt with ministers in the House of Lords, and I have been on the whole really very supportive. Leila Moran just happens to be my MP. She's the MP for Oxford, unfortunately. Wow. There's not much I can do about that.
You could vote her out.
Whenever the question of recognition of the state of Palestine comes up, I always say that Palestine, whatever that is, has already been recognized by very many states without it making a scrap of difference to the situation on the ground. In international law, you shouldn't recognize a state unless it has a stable government, is willing to observe international law, has set boundaries, and a functioning government and so on, none of which so-called Palestine actually has. And as it's a private members bill, it's very unlikely to get very far. It's just another sort of flag-waving effort.
We are going to ask the audience members if they have a question for the Baroness, but let me just finally ask one question that came down on the wires a couple of hours ago, which I picked up on. UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Workers Agency based in Gaza, which of course you know, this evening, or maybe it was earlier this afternoon, placed 6 teachers on leave following a watchdog report exposing posts calling for violence against Jewish people. Did you know that Britain is one of the world's largest donors to UNRWA, and what can we do about it?
This isn't news to me. I and the other Israel supporters in the House of Lords, Lord Turnberg, Lord Polak, Lord Palmer, Lord Lee, are always pestering the government and pointing out that money spent on UNRWA is a complete waste of money, and it's probably sidetracked to fund Palestinian terrorists as well, or their families. The material in the textbooks that they support is absolutely dreadful, and they are raising another generation of children with the notion that Israel should be wiped off the face of the map. When you listen to the cry from the river to the sea, what it means is the end of Israel and the expulsion of every Jewish person from the Middle East. So no, we shouldn't be supporting UNRWA, and we do keep trying. I've written to the British representative on the UNRWA advisory board. She's also our British consul in East Jerusalem. She doesn't answer. She doesn't answer. I've had meetings with foreign ministers together with my friends in the House of Lords, and they nod, but they don't actually do anything. No, we're wasting our money on UNRWA. It is a wholly artificial organisation. The great majority of the people it supports are not refugees at all.
Well, if you think that we at the National Jewish Assembly could do something, I mean, if the Lords can't do it, then I'm not sure what we can do, but nevertheless, perhaps we can speak about this. Baroness Ruth Deech, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you and meeting with you virtually for the first time. We will have some questions for the audience, okay. And to organise that, let me just hand back to Gary, the chairman.
James, thank you very much for conducting that interview with Baroness Deech. Now it's your turn. Can I see, please, anyone who wishes to ask a question or make a point? Please, could you raise your hand, not by doing that, but by going to the reactions box at the bottom of your screen and clicking on raise hand. Okay, go to the reaction box at the bottom of the screen and click on raise hand. So I see Ruth Hart and then Rosie. Ruth. Can we unmute Ruth, please?
Good evening. Would Baroness Deech agree that perhaps the only solution to wasting taxpayers' money on UNRWA is to quit the UN?
Sadly, I just don't think that's realistic. You know, I can't see Britain doing that. There has been talk of decent countries setting up an alternative organisation. I mean, this audience here knows that if you don't like one organisation, you can go and set up another one. So maybe, I mean, an inner circle of UN members with similar shared values might be a good thing. But it's quite unrealistic to think that we'll leave the UN. I mean, it's just, you know, it's just not on, I'm afraid.
Okay, Rosie, and then Carol. Rosie.
Hello, good evening. Hi, Baroness Deech. I agreed with every word you said, and in fact, I had a letter published in the Times a couple of years ago to that effect. There is something which has troubled me very much on a legal front, and I'm sure you know that Nadim Zahawi, the education minister, who's very pro-Israel, pro-us, brought in a law, or maybe a direction, on the 7th of February to say that any teaching in schools of contentious issue, and he made a point of mentioning Israel-Palestine, so obviously he had it in mind, has to be done in a balanced way. Now, I don't know whether you followed or you know about a very insidious, supposedly respectable organization called the Balfour Project, headed by an Arabist, one Sir Vincent Feen, who puts it about, of course, their aim is exactly to have Palestine recognized immediately by the British government. And the fact that most of the world may have recognized it, that would be a new low, because Great Britain is not just another little tin pot country, at least not yet. The problem is now that they have gone behind people's back, and they, on Saturday, they had an online workshop for 3 hours to instruct teachers how to teach this very important subject. And of course, it's going against the law by the back door. And the trouble is that one of the things about Israel education, which I've always found troubling, and of course it comes from Israel as well, is one of the reasons, or the main reasons for the existence of Israel, is the safe haven argument. I'm sorry, the reason that we have this country is because it is our historic homeland, and it was by binding treaty in 1920 that this is our land, in fact, actually up to the Iraqi border. So that's another point. Is there anything we can do about this latest so-called initiative by the Balfour Project? Because that could open the floodgates for more of this poison to infiltrate the school system.
I'm very sorry about the Balfour Project. They hijacked the name of Balfour. They got going even before the Balfour 100 website of the Jewish community a few years ago. And I have been in correspondence with their chief, pointing out that the Balfour Declaration actually had three parts. One was the Jewish homeland, one was the rights of the Arab citizens living there, and the third was that the civil rights of Jews living elsewhere should also be safeguarded. Now, we know exactly what happened to the Jews living elsewhere. If they weren't killed in the Second World War, they were expelled from Middle Eastern countries in the 1940s. And the Balfour Project, I think, is really insidious because they use the name Balfour.
Exactly.
And that's why I think it is so urgent that we overhaul Holocaust education and turn it into education about Jews and education about Israel. And it really upsets me when I see all the ventures, I mean, the Holocaust Educational Trust and so on, terribly well-meaning, they're busy, doing this, doing that. But what effect is it having? You know, it's got to be overhauled so that it is available, not just to young people, but to teachers. And all I can say is perhaps you in this organization would have the resources to put something together and send it out to schools. Because digital means that it's much easier to reach people all over the country.
Thank you.
Do
Thank
your
you
own
very
project.
much. Sorry, Carol. You're on mute, Carol. Right.
Kol hakavod, Baroness Deech. I start with 2 points. I took my kippah off even before you started delivering your address, and I was right. And something else, I confess, everything you said is exactly as I meant to address. You took all my ideas, which I bow to you. Regarding the, I know flattery will get me nowhere. Regarding the Holocaust Memorial, definitely no. No, absolutely not, for a variety of reasons. One of them is that apart from being used by enemies of the Jews for their own reasons, it will have, like many other such projects, an debilitating effect on the Jewish psyche. It repeats the same story that we were defenseless, helpless victims, the mercy of others, instead of concentrating on the fact we survived, we are thriving, we are an example to the rest of the world. The world needs us and the Jewish contribution. So we should forget about one more memorial. I think this is something that should be said loud and clear. I wish you well.
I completely agree. You know, you and I are obviously kindred spirits on this. I really do agree about that, I must say, yes. No more presentation. We've had enough presentation of us as helpless victims. We need to show the Jewish people as they are today. That's the important thing. And the memorial, I suppose, it suits non-Jews who are trying to perhaps displace guilt, displace feelings of anti-Semitism, maybe atone. Might suit them, but I don't really think that it suits us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to ask a question? Put your virtual hand up if you can. If not, I have a question actually. I would like to ask you about the timetable going forward towards a final decision being taken one way or the other. It seems that you're winning the battle, but I'm not certain that you are. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about how things are panning out over the next few months in terms of decisions.
Yes, well, it's hard to say. The public inquiry, well, first of all, Westminster City Council turned it down. It was known they were going to turn it down, and to try and beat them to it, Lord Pickles and somebody else went to see the relevant minister and asked for it to be called in, which means the minister would make the decision. So that took another year and a half or so, and there was a public inquiry with barristers costing a great deal. Thank goodness I found a friend who's barrister to represent me. I didn't realize quite how legal it was going to be. Public inquiry said that it should go ahead on the ground that even though there was going to be damage to the park, this was outweighed by the benefit. They swallowed the argument about it's important to have it in Westminster because it's a symbol of democracy and so on. And then we appealed to the High Court, and the High Court overturned the planning decision on the ground, as I and others had often said, there is a statute, there's an Act of Parliament of 1900, which says that Victoria Tower Gardens must always be kept open. So we won that, which seemed to me pretty obvious, but the government is now seeking leave to appeal. So they may appeal against that, and it will turn on, if they get leave, which I expect they will, it will turn on how the Court of Appeal interprets that statute of 1900. In the meantime, the costs are rising. In the meantime, people are getting more and more worried about flooding and security and so on. So we will see. I'm not putting bets on it at all. And by the way, I wanted to say this. I bet none of you were ever consulted about it or about the design. Don't know where it came from. The design is 23 pillars sticking upwards, looking like a toast rack, as I said. What does this mean? The architect said it represented 23 communities wiped out by the Nazis. Well, I didn't know that. And Richard Evans, Sir Richard Evans, who was a professor at Cambridge and our greatest historian of German matters. He featured in that film about David Irving and Deborah Lipstadt. He says the figure is just nonsense. It depends how you count. It's more than 23 or less than 20. It doesn't mean anything. No one's going to walk past it and say, oh, the Holocaust. It's not going to speak to your soul or your heart or anything like that. So I do hope that if we're so lucky as to be able to start again, that something a bit more relevant will come forward.
Thank you. I don't know, I see Claire, you're putting up your hand, but you haven't put it up virtually, but I can see you. So Claire Walford, would you unmute?
When you go to big cities like the Warsaw and the Poland Museum, and in America, the Jewish Museum there in various different cities, they're all very big, impressive museums. You come to London, the Jewish Museum is tiny, and it's stuck away in Camden Town, which is fairly central, but down the side street. Do you think the money that was proposed for the memorial could be used to expand or build a new Jewish museum in London?
That would be a wonderful idea. I fully support that. Just think what the Jewish Museum could do, not just with 100 million, with 50 million. It would be fantastic to have a great big museum of Jewish history somewhere in the middle of London. That would be absolutely fabulous, and that would do all the things that I would hope that Jewish history would do. That would be a really excellent project, yes. Write to Michael Gove and tell him. By the way, all of you, write to Michael Gove, because he is the minister at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, and it's in his remit. You write to him, because when I saw him last year, sorry, he said it's too late, but it isn't.
Okay, anyone else have any questions? We've got 5 minutes left to go. Yes, Martin, Martin Cohen, I see your hand up. Once again, I don't see your virtual hand up. Hopefully everybody knows to go to the bottom of the screen to the reactions button, which is 2 from the right. Click on that and raise your hand, like I've done, just to see you demonstrate. You can see my yellow hand up there. Okay, just for future, you'll know what to do. Okay, Martin.
Oh, okay. I press on the hand now, do I?
No, you can talk now because I know. Martin, you can talk.
Okay. I'm really pleased with the way it's going this evening. I just have a couple of questions actually as well, but also to state that I honestly believe that the establishment in this country, apart from a short period of time leading up to the Balfour Declaration and shortly afterwards, has always been fanatically Jew hateful. I never use the term anti-Semitic, I say Jew hate, because that's what it is. After the Balfour Declaration, and the lady earlier mentioned the San Remo resolution, that was actually put into law within the League of Nations, which was then accepted by the United Nations, that Israel is actually a legal entity. It has more legality than, for example, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and so on. Why do we not hear this much more often? I tend to hear this more on a Christian channel than I do on a Jewish channel. First of all,
that's true. I mean, I think this is another reason for wanting to propagate Jewish history, not just with non-Jews, but with Jews as well. We all need some Jewish history. And the San Remo Declaration and the League and what happened about the foundation of Israel is really quite complicated. And I think we all need to know that. I mean, Israel, as you said, is as legal, indeed more legal, than most of the artificially created countries in the Middle East. I mean, Jordan was plonked down on territory that should have been Israel. If you say to people, you know, what's the history of Jordan? They've got no idea. Where did Jordan come from? Who invented Jordan?
This has really been my whole point. That
yes.
Britain, so far as the United Nations is concerned, the resolutions against Israel. Britain is always among the leaders condemning Israel. It's also the centre for the BDS movement. I think we have to gain recognition of really what the establishment of this country stands for. And I honestly believe that we as a community have been far too docile in requesting, and we should be more demanding, the same as the Muslims do.
I agree we should be more demanding, but I have to say this current government, and indeed most of the previous ones I've dealt with, have been quite good. For example, there is a new bill going through Parliament called the Higher Education and Freedom of Speech Bill, which I hope will stop things like Israel Apartheid Week. I'm not so sure. But we do need to be more assertive using the law, which is why I think UK Lawyers for Israel, Jonathan Turner, do a very good job on that. We're not assertive enough. You're quite right.
Okay. I've got two very brief, right at the very end, the questions are coming in. So just two last questions. One from Nahum, who I know is Nigel, and then from Steve Winston. Nigel. Where are you? Ah, there you are. You're on mute, Nigel. You need to come off mute. There you go. You've gone back on mute. You need to come off mute, Nigel. Okay.
Am I right that the British
Now we can hear you.
Am I right that the British government doesn't actually recognise Israeli sovereignty over any part of Jerusalem?
I'm not sure. I think they recognise it over so-called West Jerusalem. I'm not sure about that. I mean, the embassy is still in Tel Aviv, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is a bit ridiculous. It's like, you know, us.
I've yet to see the evidence of that.
Instead of Paris. I'm not sure about that. They certainly don't recognise sovereignty over so-called East Jerusalem. Not that I like the terms East and West Jerusalem. I mean, divided cities are never a good idea, whether it's Berlin or Belfast or Nicosia or anywhere else.
Thank you.
I asked this because the government website talks about Israel and then it talks about Jerusalem as a separate entity.
Okay.
Well, I think one has to investigate that. Have a look. You know,
And if so, surely there should be representations made in government to clarify the issue.
All right, I'll bear that one in mind.
Okay, the last question now, Steve Winston, Vice Chairman.
Thanks, Gary. Good evening, Baroness Deech.
Hello.
Getting back to Holocaust education in this country, what do you think the Jewish community should do to encourage the changes that you referred to in Holocaust education in our schools here?
I think you have to get in touch with the Holocaust Educational Trust and ask them to reconsider. I mean, they've got a very well set up organisation there. They do a national job. They need to have pressure from ordinary people who contribute to them to say, look, this isn't enough. It's well-meaning, but it's not enough. It's not hitting the mark, I'm afraid. You know, lighting candles and so on, Holocaust remembrance. Mind you, the ceremonies I've been to in London have always included people from Rwanda and this and that. You know, they don't seem to me to focus on anti-Semitism and Israel today. As Jonathan Sachs said, today it's anti-Zionism, which is the anti-Semitism of today. And so many in the Jewish establishment are so keen on this Westminster Memorial, I don't know why, that maybe they're taking their eye off the ball. We need to get the chief rabbi on board. I'm not sure he really knows what's planned for inside this memorial.
Thank you. Can I now propose a vote of thanks to Baroness Deech for addressing us this evening? She's been our first speaker we've had in our organisation, National Jewish Assembly, via Zoom. It's been an honour to have your presence and your excellent contribution and answers to James's and everyone else's questions. You've given a lot of us food for thought. Not all of us are experts on the subject of the Holocaust Memorial, but you've certainly given us reasons to question the entire rationale and basis for this project, which certainly appears to be highly flawed. I want to thank you and You're welcome to stay. Our next speaker is Dov Lipman, who I'll be introducing in a moment. But I just wanted to, if we could all just give a virtual clap for Ruth Deech. It's been fantastic. And we really, really have enjoyed having you. And we look forward to seeing you again in the near future. You're very welcome to stay, although...
Thank you. I wish you all the very best. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and perhaps I will again one day. Okay,
you will, I'm sure. Thank you. Bye-bye. So now it gives me pleasure to introduce Dov Lipman, who is with us, I believe. I certainly see him here. Dov, are you there?
I am here.
Oh, great. Good to see you. Good to hear you. Thank you. Excellent. Just to introduce myself, Dov, I'm Gary Mond. I'm the chairman of the National Jewish Assembly. And I just want to briefly introduce you. You were you're a member of the Knesset for the Yesh Atid party from 2012. And I believe you were the first American-born member of the Knesset for decades who actually served there. And while you were a Knesset member, you had a number of very interesting roles in serving on important committees, such as the Finance Committee, the Immigration, the Absorption, and the Diaspora Committee, and a number of others. And you also led an interesting task force of the Knesset to get the Haredim into work, which is obviously very, very important in Israel. You've been a former Secretary General of the World Centre of United Zionism. And last year, you started up a new organization, Yad Le'olim, which is the object of it, my understanding, is to help New Olim in Israel, help their families, and help them get properly settled, which is an extremely worthwhile cause. So without further ado, Dov, I'm going to invite James Marlowe to conduct an interview with you. James.
Gary, there's not a lot of things that get my adrenaline going across the body and the energy really rising, but there is one. When a general election comes along in Israel, it really gets me excited. It's very difficult to find somebody else who feels the same way as me, but tonight, I believe that I have found someone who also gets equally excited. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to Rabbi Dov Lipman this evening. Thank you for joining us. I understand you are in maneuvers. You are flying from one place to another.
First of all, it's great to be with you, and I'm sitting in Ben Gurion Airport as we speak, waiting for a flight. So I apologize in advance for the crazy earphones that I'm wearing, and also if there's any noise in the background.
No, that's okay, because I was going to ask you, because of course the breaking news this evening, so I got a feeling that you probably got it. So let's just, perhaps you could just bring us up to date with regard to the Prime Minister's press conference at 8 p.m. this evening in Israel, and then also why or how have we got to another general election, the fifth one in 3.5 years?
Absolutely. So I'll jump to the end of the story, which is what you're referring to right now, which is that Israel's 13th Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, who has been sitting in this position for just over a year, he has announced tonight that he is not going to be running in the next election and will be taking a pause from any kind of political activity, which is quite startling, just in terms of imagining where this person has been sitting and where he will be continuing on. The story of this election is, which by the way has not been voted on officially by the Knesset. It was scheduled to happen tonight, but can you imagine? We can't even get it together to disperse the Knesset. That just gives you a sense of the political turmoil that Israel is in. It'll probably take place tomorrow. Essentially, this government that was put together by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, who will be taking over as prime minister, was an attempt to do something that really has not happened in Israel. We've had a national unity government, which brought Likud and Labor together. But the idea of going from a party like Yamina, led by Bennett, or New Hope, led by Gideon Sa'ar, who ideologically are very, very much in the right wing in terms of their perspective about Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, in terms of their perspective about Greater Israel, together with the Meretz Party on the far left, which is anxious to make a deal with the Palestinians, which will include giving up significant parts of land that is at the moment under Israeli control, and even with an Arab party called Ram. That's a very, very challenging experiment. They did so in order to accomplish two things. Number one, their goal was to try to wrestle the premiership away from Netanyahu. and they were able to barely put together a coalition. Remember, the parliament in Israel has 120 seats. So for majority, you need the 61. They started out with 62, with the Arab party of Ram together with them. And they have to manage that and deal with all of the ideological issues from right wing to left wing, religious to secular, Jew and Arab. And it was a very difficult balancing act. From the get-go, they lost one seat in the coalition as Amichai Shikli from Yamina, from Bennett's party, left immediately. And that left them with 61-59. I am not jealous of a prime minister of a government of 61-59, which basically means every single member of Knesset in that coalition can say, if you, Mr. Prime Minister, don't give me what I'm asking for, I am out, and you no longer have a majority. And for those who don't know, the Knesset has a vote of no confidence in the government every single week, like clockwork. And I mean that without making a joke. It's every Monday at 6 p.m. you will have a vote of no confidence. So if I'm the prime minister, I have to give in to all of these individual MKs or parties that are making demands, or else the government will topple. So it was a very delicate 61-59. Then there was another member of Knesset who pulled out, making it 60-60. And then at that point, everything begins to go downhill from there.
So let me ask you, because I've got a number of questions to ask on this before we move on. So firstly, there was the 8-party government coalition. Were you surprised it lasted this long, 1 year?
I was surprised, but let me say it this way. I was surprised that it lasted for the first month. Once it lasted for the first month, I actually believed it could last longer than this year, because it seemed like all of the different parties involved were interested in trying to go out of their way to make it work. So I felt that once it got over that initial hump, I thought it could last for longer.
Can you briefly explain the law that is about to expire tomorrow night regarding Israelis living in Judea and Samaria?
And this, James,
which is the reason why I believe this election is coming out.
Exactly. And this is actually why Naftali Bennett decided to disperse the Knesset. Since 1967, when Israel took control of Judea and Samaria, of the West Bank, every single government, right-wing or left-wing, has passed a law called the Law of Judea and Samaria, which basically says, even though Israel is not annexing that area in order to become officially part of Israel, the Jewish citizens who live there do have the rights as Israeli citizens. They have the right to vote. They have tax responsibilities. They have the protection of the Israeli police. All Israeli law applies to them and to their functioning, and every government has passed that. It comes up every few years, and sure enough, it came up now during this government. And this was a real test, because now all of a sudden you had the Ram party, which has 4 seats in this government of 61, and one of the members of Ram voted against this legislation. An Arab member of the Meretz party voted against this legislation, and that toppled the legislation. Now all of a sudden we have a opposition, which is numbering 61 and not enabling this law to pass. Naftali Bennett, as prime minister, met with various government authorities and said, what do we do? What happens if June 30th comes and goes and we haven't passed this law? And they basically explained to him that there will be total chaos and lawlessness amongst the Jewish areas in the Judea and Samaria in the West Bank. And Bennett said, I cannot allow that to happen. I need to collapse the government, enable then the opposition parties who support this law to vote for it, and make sure that at least we don't have a chaos and we have law and order in the Jewish settlements, in the Jewish areas of Judea and Samaria. But that is actually what led to the decision to disperse the government.
I could talk to you about this for hours, but I got a feeling that some of the stuff that you're actually saying might be going over the heads of some of our audience members. So let me just take you back several years before 2013, when you entered Parliament yourself. Incidentally and ironically, last Friday night, I poured out some sheets of different writings of Torah that I've collected over the last 30 years. And I poured out something from the Israel Center, the OU Center. I thought it was a great little word. And on the back of it, would you believe it or not, was actually your name written. You asked 3 points, and it actually says right at the bottom, who is Rabbi Lipman? He teaches at Mahon Ma'ayon in Beit Shemesh. He's the director of Anglos for Shalem. And what is Shalem? The new political movement of MK, Chaim Shalem. is that how you got interested in politics, and how did you get on the Yesh Atid list?
So, I'm an educator by background. I had no political aspirations. I was a relatively new immigrant to Israel. But in the city where I live in Beit Shemesh, I started realizing, we talk all the time about Israel's conflict with its external enemies, countries surrounding Israel that seek its destruction, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What I started realizing was we have real issues amongst the Jewish people in Israel, religious and secular, ultra-Orthodox, and the rest of the population. And from my perspective, that was the greatest threat to Israel's future. And I wanted to do something about it. That led me to get involved with a movement called Am Shalem, which means the complete nation. And we were talking about trying to break down the divisions between the populations in Israel. And then once that wasn't really taking off as a political movement, I started to explore, is any other party talking about these issues? Everyone's talking about security, everyone's talking about economy, but what about the Jewish people in the state of Israel? And that's when I came across Yair Lapid, who was not in my natural political camp, that's for sure. And I'll tell you the truth, he's very secular, I'm religious. How could we possibly be talking to each other? But thank God we had the
And he was
foresight.
also the son of Tommy Lapid as well, which perhaps doesn't make it even better.
Correct. I heard Yair speak a few times, and I really was touched by his desire to try to bring together the religious and secular for a new contract in Israel. And he was talking about the Jewish people in Israel and how should we solve the conflicts of religion and state. I grew up in the United States of America. We have separation of church and state. In Israel, we don't have separation of church and state. We want to be a Jewish state. But let me just give some of the people in the audience an idea of what we're talking about. What should the Sabbath day look like in the Jewish state? On the one hand, as a Jewish state, we'd want there to be a feeling of Shabbat, permeating all of the atmosphere of Israel on that day. So for me, that means I'm religiously observant and I don't drive, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a secular population in Israel. This is their one day off of the week from work, where they want to visit their grandmother or go to the beach and have freedom to do whatever they want to do. How do you find that balance between Jewish and democratic? That applies to marriage in Israel, applies to law of return, conversion, it applies to the draft to the army. And Yair Lapid was talking about those issues. And I felt that I had an actual partner who I could work with. I'm on the religious side, he's on the secular side. Let's sit together and try to work out understanding and compromise and a new contract for the Jewish people in Israel and bring unity. Unity does not mean uniformity. It doesn't mean we have to be exactly the same, but it means that we agree to live in coexistence and tolerance. And that's been my driving force since I got involved in politics in Israel. And that's ultimately what brought me to Yesh Atid.
So Yair Lapid put you on the, if I remember correctly, the number 17 spot on the list. Yesh Atid party, which was a brand new party at that time. We're talking about the run up to the 2013 election. Yesh Atid was polling, as you know, I'm a maverick in polls, 11, maximum 12 seats. There was no way that you were going to get in. And yet the results showed that night, and I was at one of the parties when the exit polls came through, and I admit it wasn't Yesh Atid, but 19 seats was what came through. Were you surprised that you got in?
I was absolutely surprised. Even when I accepted to run, I said to Yair, I accept with great honor. I know that I won't be a member of Knesset. That's fine. I just want to help write the laws about religion and state. He said, you're going to get in, you'll see. But I will tell you, James, there was one person in the world who absolutely believed that I was going to be elected to the Knesset. And that was my mother, who, like a good Jewish mom, made aliyah to vote for me in the election. So that's called dedication. But other than my mom, I don't think anybody really believed there was a possibility.
And at your opening speech, she was there in the gallery, if I recall.
That is correct.
And you also mentioned your father in the gallery in that opening speech.
So every single member of Knesset is asked to give an inaugural address. As an American immigrant, I asked to be the last one on the list because my Hebrew, well, I was so scared about getting up to that podium and having to speak. And it was really fascinating because I spoke, and I obviously thanked my mom, and I mentioned my father of blessed memory, who unfortunately wasn't able to be there. But what's interesting was I worked so hard not to get emotional talking about my father. I'm a member of Knesset. I'm speaking from the podium. How can I be emotional? And I had to play all kinds of mind games to not get emotional while I was talking about him. And then a few days later, another member of Knesset spoke, Yaakov Perry, who was the former head of the Shabak, the internal Israeli security agency. And he talked about a good friend of his who passed away, and he teared up and he was crying. And I realized I don't have to put up a facade. You can be your real person when you speak from the Knesset podium as well. But it was very, very emotional and inspirational for me to be blessed to be put into that position.
Right. I recall that very much so. You broke up with Yair Lapid. Can you say why?
So first of all, Yair Lapid has been foreign minister for the last year, and in my work in trying to help Jews and people get into Israel during Corona, he and his staff have been wonderful. We have a wonderful working relationship. I made a decision to leave Yesh Atid because being involved in a political party while trying to do all kinds of other good things for the Jewish people in Israel is very difficult because people label you immediately as you're attached to this party. We see you in the political lens. I was trying to work on the integration of the ultra-Orthodox into Israeli society. I was trying to work in the Knesset, trying to help Olim with a wide array of issues. And I wanted to be seen completely as apolitical, and that enabled me to have that freedom. So I left the party, but with actually no animosity or issues at all.
A couple of short questions, because I've got a number of them over here as well, before we go to the audience for some questions. Were you surprised about Bennett's resignation tonight?
I was not. I've been in the Knesset almost every day this week and talking to people. He's not in a place right now where he's going to do what has to be done to fight in an election and try to get the 4 seats that are necessarily to get in to cross the threshold. His party was teetering around that threshold of 3.25%. It's been an intense year for him. He'll continue on as the alternate prime minister and have the portfolio of Iran, which will keep him busy until a new government is formed. But he needed a break. I would not be surprised, though, if we see him come back again in some form or another.
Yamina MK Amichai Shikli, who you mentioned earlier on, you referenced earlier on, he's said to be starting up his new political party because, of course, he can't run on a current list because of the election law, the way it works. Do you think he's going to start that party, or are we going to see Ayelet Shaket and Shikli join together with a brand new party?
We don't know yet what's going to happen. Ayelet Shaked, who has been Bennett's partner since he entered politics when I did in 2013, she has a lot of soul searching to do and try to decide exactly which direction she wants to go in. I will tell you this. Starting a brand new party and getting in the 3.25% threshold is extremely difficult to do. There's a big gap between people who support you, like you, want you to be in the Knesset, but actually vote for you. People have been turning to me and saying there should be an Olim party, there should be an Anglo-Olim party. And I'm sure that would make a lot of noise if we announced something like that, but to get the 160, 170,000 people to vote for you, as opposed to some of the more established parties, is a big risk to take. And therefore, I'd be surprised if a brand new party was formed and successful in getting into the Knesset.
But of course, the alternative is 2 right-wing parties taking votes from each other, taking votes, and then, of course, neither of them get through. Let me just ask you quickly about Netanyahu. Of course, everyone knows he's got 3 indictments against him. The court process is very, very long inside of Israel, as it is with other countries as well. Do you feel, unlike Victor Lieberman and Gideon Sa'ar, that the public know who he is? He's the leader of the Likud party. He's polling quite high. Do you feel that he should run, and therefore the people should decide?
The bottom line is that the Likud party is a Democratic party. They do have primaries, both for their leader and for their list. And the Likud voters are choosing Netanyahu time and time again. I'm a believer in democracy, and I believe that they have the right to make that choice. I do certainly see people who are, if I'm now speaking for people on the right wing in Israel, I could see frustration because if Netanyahu would move aside and allow someone else to lead the Likud, there would be a very strong right wing government bringing in New Hope, bringing in Yamina, bringing in Yisrael Beitenu of Lieberman. So I could see that frustration. But at the same time, I applaud the Likud party for having a primaries, for having a democratic process. And as long as he's voted in that process, it's not for me to be able to criticize and say that he shouldn't be running.
So no, you say exactly the same as Bennett then, that he should be allowed to run. Of course, if there was, as we know, if there was a new leader, the polls are showing that it would only get 24, 25 seats if you're really lucky. Let me ask you this, electoral reform. When you were an MK and beforehand, I was also a campaigner for electoral reform in Israel around 2003, 4, 5, 6, and 7. I came across a lot of meetings, a lot of government officers. officials and government ministries. It was a brick wall. Did you come up against the same? Did you make any progress? And is it worth returning back to that idea?
So starting from the end of your question, it is absolutely worthwhile. This is the kind of issue which we should never take off the table and should always be working on, because Israel desperately needs electoral reform. A lot of people don't realize David Ben-Gurion left the Labor Party in the late 1960s because he felt that Israel needed to change its electoral process. He said, we established this in 1948 under emergency circumstances, and now a few decades in, we have to be rethinking it and making changes to it. I did work on it as a member of Knesset. I had complete proposals, including dividing Israel into 60 different regions, having regional representation, changing a lot of things about it, a full plan in place. And most of the parties wouldn't even hear of it. So people talk about it a lot. There's a lot of lip service, but when it comes down to getting to work and trying to make changes, there's a lot of hesitation.
We don't have the time right now, but I'd be fascinated to find out what your views were at that time. Maybe we can compare notes. Let me just move on to your new organization. During the pandemic, many Israelis found themselves stranded outside of the country, some because they chose to ignore the requested rules, just taking a holiday, others because they specifically had a parent or a member of family to bury or see somebody sick. They couldn't get back into the country. They phoned around a lot of people, and you were the go-man, if I may say so, for the Anglos. Is that how your organization got started up, Yad Le'olim?
I'm sure if my wife was here, she would say she wishes it was just for the Anglos. I was being bombarded with phone calls, emails, WhatsApp messages, and Facebook from people from 22 different countries all around the world. There were times that I was simultaneously having conversations in Italian, French, and Spanish. I do not know those languages. It was using Google Translate, but I was trying to help people, both people who lived in Israel or their families who wanted to come into Israel. So I was helping people get their permits, working with the government authorities, working with the government to change the policies to enable people to come in. And that was the impetus to starting Yad Le'olim, because it reached a point where last year I was getting close to 1,000 messages a day and really could not keep up on my own. So I hired a small staff, I got a website going. And then as we built Yad Le'olim, we realized this is not just about Corona, because for years I've been getting requests for help for a wide range of issues that Olim have, navigating Israeli bureaucracy, the healthcare system, the education system, just getting their documents in order for whatever the process may be, and also to be a voice for Olim in the government itself. So Yad Le'olim was established officially last June. We've gone from just me to now 17 employees who are working for the organization. We have 3 divisions: government relations, absorption assistance, and now a Ukrainian, Russian Olim division for those who are coming from the war. And we are busy morning, afternoon, and night trying to make sure that Olim get the help that they need to settle and be successful in Israel, and also advocating to the government to change policies and change legislation to make things better for the immigrant population.
Did you say 17 employees? Are they paid employees?
Yes, 17
Wow.
paid employees. Just in 1 year, we went from I was not even paid, from 0 to 17, and it's going to continue to grow.
So for those people who might be thinking about making Aliyah or returning to Israel, and they come up against this bureaucracy and paperwork and standing in line for several days in some cases because you have to go back, and would you suggest that they should come to you or speak to one of your representatives?
Absolutely. They can go to yadleolim.org, to our website, the Yad Le'olim website, and there's a pretty easy to use way to contact us. Choose the issue that you need assistance with, and we will absolutely be in touch with you and do our best to help everyone with whatever they're dealing with. Sometimes the challenges that people have are not surmountable, meaning there might be a legal issue and we might have to say at a certain point we can't help you, but to whatever extent we can help people, we are available. We're here to educate and also to hold people's hands through the process.
And finally, just before we go to audience questions, my last question is, how do you keep Olim in Israel? They say the aggression, especially in Jerusalem, although it's much more milder in Ra'anana, they say the bureaucracy, the low wages, the high cost of living, and that pushes. Israel's very good at encouraging people to move there, but it's not very good at keeping them there. What do you say to those people?
So first of all, I do not believe that someone should move to Israel unless ideologically they are very passionate about it. I do believe that there's nothing greater than being part of the Jewish state in the 21st century and be part of the development of this unbelievable story where the destiny of the Jewish people is heading. But you have to have that ideology behind you and that passion to be able to withstand all the challenges. Anyone who looks at you and says Aliyah is easy is not telling you the truth. It's worthwhile, but it's not easy. And you just have to have this passion and belief that this is where I belong, this is where my family belongs, and then that enables you to get through all the hurdles and obstacles that come along the way.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Dov Lipman. I wish you so much luck and continued success with your organization as well. We will have questions from the audience, and to organize that, I hand back to the chairman, Gary Mond.
Thank you.
And whenever Gary Mond
Thank
wishes
you very
to
much.
pick up, there you go.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, James, for that comprehensive interview there. And thank you, Rabbi Dov Lipman, for your answers. Can I now see any questions? Remember to put your hand up virtually. Well, if I can't see any questions right now, I'm going to ask a question. I am of the opinion, which may be outside what the opinion polls think, that Netanyahu is going to win by a landslide. And I think so, because I think that quite a number of those who voted for parties like Blue and White, like Gideon Sa'ar's party, like Israel Beitenu, will feel they've been let down by their respective parties, and they're likely to revert back to what might well have been their original home party. And I think Netanyahu might end up with well north of 40 mandates, enabling to form a government with the religious parties. What do you think of that analysis?
So I agree with the final mathematics of your suggestion, but not the reason for it. I do not actually see voters of Yamina, New Hope, Blue and White, Israel Beitenu shifting to support Netanyahu for prime minister. Their very existence lately has been, we will not support Netanyahu for prime minister. But I do believe, if I had to guess right now what will happen, that Netanyahu will be successful in criticizing the experiment that was done in this government and rally more people within his camp to actually come out and vote. And because of that, right now, according to the polls, he's anywhere around 58, 59 in his camp. All it'll take is one of the ultra-Orthodox parties to get one more mandate, him to get two more mandates, and then he'll get to that magic number of 61. So there's one of two options that will happen here. One option is Netanyahu gets to 61. The other option is nobody does. But here is a very important point for everybody to recognize. As opposed to the 4-election cycle that we went through over the last few years, where Netanyahu just kept allowing us to go to election time and time again, that was because, remember, he was the interim prime minister. So he had no impetus to do anything else. Now he's facing a situation where Yair Lapid is the sitting prime minister. And Netanyahu will not want to go through an endless loop of elections with Lapid as prime minister. So I do believe that if he does not get to the 61, that there will be enough pressure within his camp for him to step aside and let someone else lead the Likud party and then put together 61 together with Yamina, New Hope, or whoever else might be there. So those are the two possibilities that I see moving forward. I do not see an alternate government to Netanyahu or Likud being formed after the next election.
The only small point I've got that on your analysis is that while it is the case that the politicians, Blue and White, Israel Beitenu and Sa'ar's party would really hate Netanyahu, would never sit with him, maybe their voters might feel different. That's why I feel that Netanyahu will do better. But let me now bring in Steve Winston. Steve, you're there somewhere, Vice Chairman of the NJA.
Gary, also Claire has her hand up.
Oh, she did. Oh, yes, you do. Claire, yes, you do. Sorry, you have a legitimate hand up. So I'm going to ask Steve, and then I'm going to ask Claire. We've got another 10 minutes.
Good evening, Rabbi Lipman. If I want to ask quite a personal question. If you were to get back into politics, get back into the Knesset, which party would you join and why?
So if I had $1 for every person who's asked me that question over the last few years, I'd be quite wealthy. I think I've done a pretty good job masking who I vote for and really try to give updates in an apolitical manner and do interviews on all kinds of news stations and really try to hide, where I am politically. The truth is, right now, I do not have any aspirations to get into the Knesset. I'm able to be in the committees, meet with ministers, their staffs, MKs, and we're working on real policy changes to help Olim and to make the country better for so many people. And I have the benefit of doing so without being labeled as coalition or opposition, without having to stand for re-election, without having to put anybody down along the way, which is part of the work of being in the Knesset. So at the moment, I'm very, very satisfied with the role that I'm playing. And therefore, for the moment and for the near future, certainly not being involved in the political sphere as a member of a specific party is what I see for my future.
Thank you. Thank you. Claire Walford, and then James has got another question. Claire.
I wanted to ask you about the Jewish Agency. Natan Sharansky, of course, formed a party, a political party for the Russian Olim, and it was very successful while they were coming in big floods. He then moved to the Jewish Agency and did a lot of work, again with the Olim. What is the role of the Jewish Agency now? Are you taking over from the Jewish Agency? Because that's what it sounds like. And are they now defunct?
So first of all, after I got elected to Knesset, I met Natan somewhere, and he said to me, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, Dov, you're too nice to make it in politics in Israel. And he felt that he had that experience as well. It's just very, very difficult. You're ideological driven and you don't want to get in the mud of the politics. It's very difficult to function there. So he found a place where he can make a difference without having to be involved in politics. We are not in any way replacing the Jewish Agency, but I do believe that we play a role in helping them to a certain degree with the work that they do. The Jewish Agency is limited in terms of the ability to help every single individual person with every need that they have navigating Israeli bureaucracy. But I will say, I do look forward to working with the Jewish Agency on trying to make some changes to the processes, trying to make things a little bit more transparent, try to use technology to get people's process of Aliyah to be easier, smoother, quicker. And I do believe that a lot of those changes can be made. So our organization and other Aliyah organizations are there to supplement, to fill in the holes, fill in the gaps where any government-related agency can't really get down to the detail with which we help the individual Olim. And that's the role that we play. I mean, just to give you an example, with the Ukrainian Aliyah, right? They would not have gotten to Israel without the Jewish Agency and the representatives on the ground in the border countries around Ukraine. Once they got here, we started going to the hotels and people needed help opening a bank account, getting their documents to the Interior Ministry, finding a home, finding employment. We have a pop-up shop in Cinema City where we provide them with new clothing and basic toiletries and other things. That's not the role the Jewish Agency can play on the individual level. And that's when an organization like Yad L'Olim comes in and really helps to fill that gap.
Thank you, Rabbi Dov. James, you had another question.
Yeah, we have a few minutes left, so I just wanted to actually cast you back again to 2013, if I may. And if I actually just add on to what it was that you just said for those people who are watching, what I think enhances Dov Lipman and his ability to be very successful in this organization is that he still has a past at the Knesset. He's often seen on the floor. He has many, many friends still in the Knesset from parties right across the spectrum, and therefore he can deal directly with an MK or a member of the government when they will be one, because one day they will be one. And that's probably your advantage to getting things done there and then. Here comes my question. Going back to 2013, Yesh Atid was known as a secular party. You were the only, I believe, Shomer Shabbat person on the actual Rishima. There may have been one other, but I think it was yourself mostly. And yet you received a great deal. I've got a feeling there was a woman who was also Shomer Shabbat, but it doesn't matter. And yet you received a great deal of criticism and condemnation and even some hateful comments from the religious community, specifically from segments within the Haredi community. Must have really brought you down. I understand that you received a telephone call from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and it changed a lot. Tell us about that.
So first of all, just so you can know, there were 4 of us on the list, which again, like doesn't change it that much, but that were Shomer Shabbat. The number 2 on the list is Rabbi Shai Peron, an Orthodox rabbi who was the education minister, Aliza Lavi, and actually the current Aliyah minister, Penina Tamanushata. People don't know this, but she is Shomeret Shabbat. But you are right, it was a very difficult time. A lot of public criticism, a time when we couldn't answer our phone in the home anymore. Our children weren't to answer the door any longer. There were some death threats that came along with it as well. And Rabbi Sachs was visiting Israel, and I got a message that he wanted to meet with me, which was certainly a great honor. And I went to meet with him, and it was one of the most inspirational meetings I've had in my entire life, where a person of his stature, and I'm actually tearing up as I'm talking about it, where a person of his stature sat with me and looked me in the eye, and he said, "You are working for the unity of the Jewish people. You are working to help the ultra-Orthodox not be impoverished." He said both of those are holy missions. And he said, we live in a world where people who are involved in the holiest of acts are often condemned for it and are met with tremendous obstacles along the way. He said those obstacles and hurdles are not meant to stop you. They're actually messages that you're on the right path if you're dealing with lots of criticism. And he said to me, "Chazak ve'ematz," I give you strength and I give you support, and you keep going in the way that you're going. Don't get dragged down into the back and forth, and don't become someone who hurls insults at anybody else or any populations. Just keep your eye on the goal and keep working towards that. And with God's help, you'll be successful. And I want to tell you, I can look back now, 9 years later, and we have helped over 100,000 ultra-Orthodox young people get training and go to work and support their families with dignity. We have opened new units in the army to help the ultra-Orthodox go into the army but feel comfortable with units that are special for them. We opened the first ultra-Orthodox Hesder Yeshiva, where they combine together learning Torah and serving in the army. And what's amazing is, about a year, or maybe even less than a year after that conversation with Rabbi Sachs, I started getting quietly a lot of support, even from ultra-Orthodox rabbis, who told me, originally we may have thought that you were coming with some kind of animosity, or, we linked you with Yair Lapid and his father, and Yair Lapid does not have animosity either, but there was just the conception about it all. And they said, now we see that you really are, what they use the word l'shem shamayim, you're doing this for the sake of heaven. You're really trying to help. And that quiet support was certainly helpful. They wouldn't give the public support, but that's okay. But that conversation with Rabbi Sachs is one that I will absolutely never forget. And it's one that will keep me going every single moment that God gives me to be able to try to help Israel and the Jewish people.
So his death must have been devastating for you.
It was, he was not someone who I spoke to often. I did have communication here and there. But yes, it was devastating. I felt like I was just plunged into mourning. I feel that not just myself, but the Jewish people lost such a visionary and such a voice. And I often think to myself, that was one conversation that he had with me. How many other people did he have conversations with? Did he inspire? Did he lead? And the fact that he took the time to reach out to me after he heard what me and my family were going through, to me that shows someone who loves the Jewish people, who loves Israel, who loves fellow human beings, and will put themselves out to make sure that they can help somebody else.
Who were the Haredi rabbis who came to you and said, now we know that you mean it l'shem shamayim?
You may be shocked, but the condition was that I can't reveal. Not only that, I would get these phone calls. I would get these phone calls saying, I want to meet with you. So I'd say, okay, I'll come to your yeshiva. And they said, no, don't come to my yeshiva. We'll meet you in your house. I said, okay, it's 9 o'clock okay? They said, how about 1 o'clock in the morning? So we'd have these random people that would pull up to my house at 1 o'clock in the morning to meet with me and give me support and say, please keep doing what you're doing because you're helping our community in ways that we actually cannot come out and help in that way. So
okay, we have time for just one more question. One more question. Matthew Offord is with us, so we'll be moving on to Matthew very shortly. But any one final time for one more question for Rabbi Dov Lipman? Yes, Martin Cohen, you have your hand up. You're on mute, Martin.
I'm mute. Sorry.
That's fine.
Sorry, I made Aliyah many years ago and failed. The ideology was still there, but it was a very bad time. I was there in time for the Yom Kippur War. and I was called up. אני נשבעת. 2750181. Unfortunately, at the time, you had a lot of the Russians coming in, and I was told unequivocally they did not want Olim from the West. Bar Shaliach, of all people. Now you have a lot of people coming in from all over. Is that attitude still relevant? Because they just assumed that if you came from the West, you had a pot of gold in your case, which unfortunately for me was not the case. So what's the situation? I mean, I'm too old for Aliyah, I'm 81. So what is the real reality of Aliyah today? For people who want to go, they have the ideology there, but with all the people coming in from all over the world, do they still really want people from, particularly from England?
So first of all, I can't even imagine what you went through, and you're an inspiration to me that you
I
made
left in
Aliyah.
75, by the way.
That you made Aliyah during that time, and the fact that you served and were called up to duty, it's something which is absolutely remarkable. And I just want to, from the bottom of my heart, say thank you for the role that you played in helping Israel. Israel is very much favorable towards Aliyah, but you are 100% correct. They assume that people who make Aliyah from Western English-speaking countries don't have the same needs as those who come from other locations. That's part of what we're doing in our Yad L'Olim organization, is bringing the information to the government for them to understand there are real challenges, there are real difficulties. And even if people do come with money, first of all, not all of us do, but even if one does, it doesn't mean that they have all of their needs taken care of for them. So that's part of the shift that's taking place, and hopefully we'll be successful in doing so. I don't know your personal situation, and I do not say that everyone should drop everything and make Aliyah. I will just mention that on our Aliyah flight in 2004, the oldest Ole was 82 years old, making his Aliyah. But again, like I said, you've certainly made a contribution, and no one can question that at all.
Rabbi Dov Lipman, can I thank you on behalf of the National Jewish Assembly for an amazing talk this evening. You've certainly enlightened me, and I'm sure you've enlightened many of us, about the state of play of Israel politics at the moment. It's very much a situation of flux. It's very much an uncertainty, and it'd be although I've actually said what I think might happen, I think one would be very brave to bet too much money on the outcome. And certainly your comments about Rabbi Sachs are very, very touching. I think that I speak for most of us, and maybe all of us, in saying that we either feel the same or we at least can identify with what you're saying. So can I just say, you've been our first speaker from Israel. This is only our first Zoom meeting as a new organization. We're only 2 months old. We look forward to inviting you back again in the future, because it's been tremendous having you with us. And thank you for being so kind as to give up your time from Ben Gurion Airport. And I wish you a safe flight wherever you're flying to.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate having the time with all of you. I look forward to coming back again, and hopefully that will be from the comfort of my home and not with whatever background noise you're hearing here. But I wish everyone well, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you. You're welcome to stay, but I fully understand if you need to go, but you're very welcome to stay if you like.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi Lipman. So our next speaker is a friend of mine, is Matthew Offord, the Conservative Member of Parliament for Hendon. He's been the Member of Parliament for Hendon since 2010. Prior to that, he began his political career as a parliamentary candidate in a safe Labour seat up in Barnsley East and Mexborough back in 2001. And then he was elected for the Hendon wards to Barnet Council in 2002 and spent, I think, 8 years on the council, where you rose to becoming deputy leader of Barnet Council. And as I say, you've been a member of Parliament now for 12 years for Hendon, starting off with a really tiny majority, but building on it since then. And we hope you continue to build on it. And you've been an officer of the Conservative Friends of Israel. You're also a member of the European Reform Group, and you've been a Brexit supporter. So Matthew, without further ado, I'm now going to invite James Barlow, our Chief Executive, to quiz you.
Thank you very much, Gary.
Thank you for the invite, and thank you for inviting me along tonight, Gary.
My pleasure.
We kicked off with British politics, we moved on to Israeli politics, and now we return back to the House of Commons. Boris Johnson, he won a whopping 80-seat majority in the election of December 2019, Wow, way back. It's since been reduced, of course, by a few seats due to by-elections and defections to one defection rather, to the Labour Party. But Matthew has won 4 elections as a constituency MP. He's seen 3 different prime ministers. Really delighted to be speaking to you right now. So let me kick off with asking about the Prime Minister. Despite what they say, he has led on foreign policy, on the foreign stage. He was the first to put sanctions against the Ukraine. He was the first to deliver weaponry to the Ukrainian people, in particular the NLAW, or rather the Ukrainian army, in particular the amazing NLAW anti-tank missile system. And he was the first leader to visit the Ukraine before anyone else. Do you, or rather, can I ask, does he have your backing?
I think I'm going to start by saying, James, that during the last election, I attended a hustings, and my Labour opponent was asked whether he trusted Jeremy Corbyn with the security of the country. And you can imagine there was quite a lot of discussion about this. And then it came to me, do I trust Boris Johnson with the security of the United Kingdom? And my answer was, yes, I do trust him with the security of the United Kingdom, but I don't trust him with my wife. And I think that kind of summed up, in many respects, what Boris is. On the big calls, he does the right thing. But it's some of the smaller, shall we say, the sideline issues that he seems to get wrong, whether it's the comments he makes in his newspaper columns, or indeed the parties that they had in Number 10. These are the things that people take very badly, as it would if he was coveting your wife, for example. But on the issues of security, yes, he certainly has my confidence, and he has, as you said, made the good calls on the COVID, on the vaccination program, upon Ukraine. But there are some small issues that people dislike that he sometimes drops the ball upon.
If he reaches August the 5th, or it might be August the 6th, that means he would have passed Theresa May's time in being Prime Minister. Do you think he's going to last much longer than that?
Well, the rule is under the 1922 that he is so-called safe for another year. So there can't be another confidence vote.
They said that about Theresa May, though, didn't they?
They did. The difference between Theresa May was that I know that some members of the 1922 committee went to her and said, you're not going to get this Brexit deal through. It's not going to happen. So we are effectively going to change the rules to remove you. And she decided at that point that she would go. Now, Boris isn't in that situation. So people can still complain about the things that he might or might not have done, but he doesn't have that hanging over him in the same way. His biggest concern should be the inquiry that's going on in the House of Commons about whether he misled Parliament. Personally, I don't think he did. I don't believe that he felt he did anything wrong. I think in terms of what happened in Number 10, there were some issues that were clearly against the law. But he hasn't been fined for that. He received the fixed penalty notice for an event where he had a birthday party. And I feel particularly wronged on behalf of the Chancellor, who turned up early for a meeting and was given a fixed penalty notice. But the senior civil servant, Simon Case, he was also at that meeting, but he never got a fixed penalty notice. So I feel that Boris did not mislead Parliament. He said what he believed. Now, we all know that in any situation, we learn issues afterwards, and maybe it came to light that it wasn't the appropriate thing to do. But at the time, I think he genuinely believed he'd done nothing wrong. And so I don't believe he has misled Parliament, no.
Let's move on to anti-Semitism. And I spoke with Baroness Ruth Deech about this subject earlier on, and said to her the following. Back in the 1970s, under the government of Harold Wilson, the socialists were very good friends with Israel. The Labour Party over here, related to the Labour Party, Harold Wilson sat down with Golda Meir. It was actually the Conservative Party under Edward Heath that forbade American planes to fly over British airspace heading towards Israel, bringing blood and arms and supplies during the Yom Kippur War. What do you think has changed over those years? And where has the anti-Semitism come from the far left socialists and Marxists, when it didn't seem to be there in the 70s and maybe the 80s?
I think where it's come particularly is that those people who support particularly left-wing groups always see the issue of Palestine as the totem. This is the big issue for them. No one ever talks about the settlements in Cyprus, for example, where the Turkish settlers have come over from Turkey and they've settled in the north part of Cyprus. No one ever talks about it, never even mentions it. And I always like to raise that when the settlements are raised in Parliament. And I think it's that issue that where people have seen changes across the world with different regimes have fallen and risen, the one that has remained constant has been Palestine, so-called Palestine problem. And it always remains. And so for some, that is everything. So whenever there's a discussion about America, Western imperialism or anything, it always comes down to the Palestinian people. And I think it's particularly wrong because we talk about, or some people talk about Palestinian refugees. There's people who've lived in parts of Jordan for 50 odd years, and the Jordanian government has never accepted them. People talk about the Gaza blockade. Well, what about the blockade on the Egyptian side? Why don't the Egyptians let people from Gaza into Egypt? And the simple reason is the Arab world doesn't want them. They want them to be there. They want them to be a problem that they do not want solved, that they can use to push their own agenda on different issues that benefit themselves. And the people of Gaza, and indeed the West Bank, are used as pawns. And they're certainly not used by pawns by Israel or the United Kingdom or the Quartet. They're used by certain governments around in the Middle East who want to use them to perform a leverage over any other government to get their own way on another issue. So they're part of the bargaining game.
Now, you're known as a great advocate for Israel in the House of Commons, and it's probably much more comfortable today on the Conservative benches than in the days of John Marshall from Golders Green or whatever, I think it was called Hendon South in those days, where he was under an amazing amount of barrage of rockets all the time from his own side. And I appreciate as well that there's the Jewish people and Israel have friends across the House. But have you personally, even from your own colleagues, been sort of pushed to one side and say, what are you talking about? What about the refugees? What about the occupation? What about the illegal settlements? What about the colonization? Tell us some stories.
I can think of two occasions that spring to mind. One is when we were talking about the recognition of Palestine back in 2011, I think it was. And I remember a good friend of mine, Edward Lee, stood up and intervened and said, it appears that you're reading an Israeli embassy press release.
I was watching that live at the time.
Took a little bit of offense to that. And the second occasion, I remember when our good friend Alan Duncan stood up in a Westminster Hall debate and said, if I and others were basing our premise upon a foundation of peace between the coexistence of the two communities, then would I like to condemn the settlements in Israel? And I said, I don't need to. The Supreme Court has already done that in Israel. I don't need to get involved in that. Israel has a legitimate, sovereign legal system, and they will make decisions upon that. So I don't need to do that. They've already done it for me. So there are occasions when people will, use that against you, and certainly will question you as a conservative. But I think the point to make is that not only is Israel the democracy in the Middle East, but also we shouldn't forget there's many Arab countries that are on very good relations with Israel, whether publicly or privately. I include Saudi Arabia in that. And Saudi is very keen that Iran does not gain nuclear capability. And Israel is the one who constantly prevents that from happening, either by taking direct military action on occasion, or certainly through some of our work on things like the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that Israel is always the one leading. And I know that behind the scenes, there are many Arab countries that do not want places like Iran to get the kind of weaponry it wants, because it will affect the other parts of the Arab world. So there's a lot of cheerleaders in the Arab world for Israel, but very quietly.
I was going to come on to Iran anyway, but I was referring more because the two examples that you just cited were actually in front of the cameras. What about walking down the corridors on the sides of the House when you're about to vote? Has anyone ever pushed you and said, what are you doing? Or said certain words to you? Because I know of MPs that had that problem in the late 90s.
Right, well, I certainly have never had that. On the occasion that we voted against recognition of Palestine, myself and Mike Freer, the MP in Finching Golders Green, we voted against, but the party decided to abstain because the party did not want to be seen to lose a vote upon that. But our most recent discussion upon the recognition of Palestine, I was very keen to intervene on Liam Byrne, for example, because he was a friend of Tony Blair's, and that's fine. And what I wanted to put to him, is, as his friend Tony Blair said, recognition of Palestine is it's too early. It's the wrong thing to do. And what was his opinion on that, particularly as Tony Blair made those comments when he was the Middle East peace envoy. But the Labour Party, they wouldn't let me intervene upon them to ask that question. But no one's ever threatened me. I'm certainly, I feel that I can defend myself through Parliament and the language I use. And I hope that our language actually prevents that kind of behaviour.
What is it that drives you to be so pro-Israel? Is it because you were a councillor in Barnet and you mix with the Jewish community on a regular basis, or is it something that you really believe in it even before you got into politics?
Well, one thing I once said again at another hustings was it would be so easy if I didn't have Jewish constituents, and there was a lot of laughter at this. And I didn't mean that because they may come to me with issues. What I meant was that people would say, well, of course, you would support Israel, wouldn't you? Because you have a lot of constituents who also support Israel. If you went against Israel, then clearly they wouldn't support you. But no, I certainly believe in a democratic free state. It's a secular state. It has a democracy that other parts of the world do not have. People are free to live their lives in any way they want. And that is not true of other parts of the Middle East, countries very close by, where we see not only religious intolerance, but we see intolerance in people's sexuality. We see there's a lot of problems with the treatment of women. And Israel is none of those things. It is a state that is the startup nation. It's a very young nation. It effectively took a land of sand and made something of it. And that's something to be proud of. And it is a friend of the West. It is part of the West. But also, I'm a Christian. So for me, it's very important to have the Jewish homeland. So there's lots of different reasons. And yes, I've always been supportive of the Jewish state, of the state of Israel.
I remember seeing you in the Knesset myself when you travelled with David Cameron.
That's right.
Around 2013 or 2014, maybe around that time.
Yes.
How many times have you travelled to Israel?
I forget now, but one thing I want to do is go to Israel independently, because all the things I want to do, I never get the opportunity. I tend to meet, for example, the president or the prime minister or other ministers. And I've never been to Masada. And I would very much like to. I've been to places like Galilee, but I would also like to do some scuba diving, perhaps in Eilat, but also walk around parts of the Jordan River. So there's a lot of things I would like to do on a personal level that I haven't had the opportunity yet. So maybe this summer.
It's probably the perfect time to do it right now, because Israel might struggle to get a government for some time to come.
Well, the one piece of advice I remember giving to Benjamin Netanyahu was that he should get rid of that PR system. Get first past the post. That'll sort all your problems out.
You were a journalist before you became a Conservative councillor. Where did you work, and did you always want to become an MP? Was that the natural progression? And did you ever want to get onto the front benches into the government?
Well, there's three issues there. The first one was I worked at the BBC. And it wasn't the most easiest environment to work in. I remember having discussions about Israel with people, certainly having discussions about the Conservative Party, and lots of issues that, in many ways, issues like taxation, the hatred of America, was just imbued in people. It's what they believed in. But I liked the fact that I would have an alternative point of view, and I would certainly express that whenever I could. And then there were secret closet Tories every now and then. Nick Robinson, for example, he was a Conservative member and in the Oxford Union. So there were other people who were Conservatives and would quietly to one side say, yes, I agree with you on that as well. Did I always want to be an MP? No, I didn't. I never thought that I could become an MP. But it was one day I was with someone from the Conservative Party who said, have you ever thought of becoming an MP? And I said, I've never considered it. And I thought, well, if they're asking me that, maybe there's a possibility. And it was the same reason that I was elected to the council, that I felt there's many important issues and I wanted to address them. And I first started doing that as a councillor. I wanted to see changes in the locality of Hendon, where I live. And then as that progressed, I became deputy leader, and there were other things that I wanted to do. And the same goes for national government as well. There's still a lot of issues that I would like to address, and I'd like to see the government address, but very slowly we are making progress on issues that are important. And would I ever like to be on the front bench? Absolutely, yes, I would. But I do feel that sometimes I am very keen on not being belligerent or being outspoken, but I believe in saying to people what I believe in. And sometimes that's not always what people want to hear. So I am quite keen on expressing an opinion. Today, for example, I criticised the Mayor of London, and I feel that the government should take away his role as the Police and Crime Commissioner. Sometimes perhaps the government may feel that that's not as diplomatic as they would like to be. But I feel it's important to say to people what you believe in, what you're going to do, and then do it. It's as simple as that.
So in other words, perhaps one of the reasons why you hadn't been asked to go on the front bench is because you are an outspoken person, which is good in a certain way.
Well, I feel when you say outspoken, I don't feel, as I say, I'm belligerent or say things out of turn, but I am quite content to ask questions and believe that the British Embassy should be relocated to Jerusalem, for example. So clearly that I would never be allowed to go into the Foreign Office because I've expressed that view publicly. But that is what I believe. It's as simple as that.
Let's move overseas. And you touched on Iran earlier on. Of course, the IAEA, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency, for those who are not sure. They're very, very concerned about the building of nuclear weapons, the enrichment of uranium, the spinning of the centrifuges, which is actually going up as well. This is what many warned, and you were one of them also that warned about this several years ago. We did have a conservative government and an American administration that were very much for this JCPOA agreement. Of course, it's all breaking down right now. How far will Iran go before Britain actually takes a step? I understand that they've said several times we will not allow Iran to get nuclear weapons. Everyone said that. But there's this difference between saying something and doing something. You can rely on Israel and perhaps the Saudis, but when would Britain get actually involved?
Well, that's a good question, and one I don't think I'm qualified to answer, because on many occasions I have criticised the government again to say I felt that was a retrograde step. We released the sanctions, and that allowed the Iranians to fund terrorism in the Middle East, in places like Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria in particular. Even it's come as close as to myself and other colleagues when the Iranian ambassador from Belgium was smuggling explosives into Belgium, where I attended a conference for the opposition group for Iran. So when would we actually step in? I think it would have to be in a situation where there was a coalition from the United Nations. The big issue for me in Iraq was that it left the Iranians off the hook, because people are very concerned now that the mistakes that were made in Iraq should not be repeated in Iran. And I feel that there's a great deal of reticence to do anything unless there was a clear act of aggression on behalf of Iran. And this is where it goes back to, we know that Israel is taking a very close interest, and I believe it does have the support of other Middle East countries, and it takes these strategic actions to prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear capability.
Of course, as we know, it's one of the reasons which has driven the Gulf states in particular closer to Israel. There's also been quiet cooperation for several years, but now in the case with the UAE and Bahrain, there is agreements specifically as a result of the fear of Iran. Can you see other Middle Eastern states joining this perhaps alliance against Iran as Iran continues to expand in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and in other places? Oh, and also in Lebanon. Can you see other Arab states joining?
Again, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because it's not just the sovereign states. It comes down to the Sunni-Shia split in Islam. And it would seem to be a sectarian aggression. And that would be very difficult for some countries. They would not like to be seen going down that route. But I think when you've seen countries such as Turkey providing assistance to NATO aircraft and UN aircraft on occasion, where they provide bases and the ability for Western military hardware to operate, that may be likely to happen. And we've seen that as well in Saudi Arabia. But I think it's a very difficult position for a Sunni country to engage in conflict with a Shia country. And that's when it becomes very difficult because of that sectarian divide.
Let's return home right now. And the next question is, where now for Matthew Offord? You're going to fight the next general election?
Well, we don't know when the next general election will be. We do know that there are boundary changes, and what has been proposed so far have not been good for the Hendon seat, has not been good for the Finchley and Golders Green seat. So we have to see what the Electoral Commission come up with. I would be very concerned if they made the changes that they were proposing. But on a simple exercise to amalgamate the seats so that they add up to broadly an average number of 77,000 electors, that doesn't look good for the Conservative Party in London. We've most recently seen Barnet Council fall to the Labour Party for the first time ever. It's quite a shock. I know that many Conservatives did not go out to vote for lots of reasons, and they may then choose to do so in a general election. But at the minute, the fortunes of the Conservative Party haven't been too good. What we need is a Prime Minister and the Chancellor to deliver, particularly on issues such as cost of living, to show that we are on the side of the people of Hendon and other parts of London.
You mentioned the Barnet Council, and yet I know that many councillors actually expect it was going to fall. Did you expect it was going to fall?
Well, it did seem likely, certainly in the weeks leading up to it, yes. Again, there were boundary changes, and so it meant a lot of the seats were being fought on different populations, and many people didn't know how those votes would cast. So it wasn't looking particularly good, no. I'm very pleased, though, in the Hendon constituency, we only lost 3 seats that we picked up in the last election. We did rather well locally.
Absolutely, yes. We will go to audience questions shortly. So if you do have a question, stand by with that. But let me return finally back to anti-Semitism, because we do have a general problem. We talked earlier about the far left, and I gave the example of how it was all good, or sort of good in the 70s. It's all changed now. The socialists and the Marxists on the far left. Of course, we have the far right problem to deal with. And also, many say, the Islamist groups in this country. And if you've ever gone down to Speaker's Corner on a Sunday morning, wow, then you're going to see some real proper hatred. And there are people who go down there with their videos. What can be done as an MP to fight this growing, rising hatred of not just against Jewish people, but of course, we're just speaking specifically about anti-Semitism?
Well, I think the government's adoption of the recognition of anti-Semitism was a very good move. And so that we, organisations, public services, now recognise what that definition is. And by ensuring that universities also sign up to the same, I think that's very useful, so that we can prevent the anti-Semitism that certainly has been experienced on some campuses in the United Kingdom. And I know that causes a lot of Jewish students concerns as well. So I think by doing that, that is the first step. Also, the government's put a good amount of money, about £40 million, into the education of the Holocaust. And I've accompanied sixth formers to visit Auschwitz. And I think those people that attend those visits are good advocates within their school to explain how the Holocaust happened, how it was a real thing, and how a civilized country that Germany was in the 1930s, and how suddenly it became Nazi Germany, and people turned against another group of people that led to the death of 6 million people, something that's unimaginable today, and certainly at the time. And I think also by protecting the Jewish community through the Places of Worship Security Fund, I've always been very keen that it's not only Jewish organisations that make benefit of that, but other organisations, so that people can't single out just the Jewish community. So we have seen in my own church in Hendon, in St Mary's, there's been attacks there of gravestones. So we see a lot of religions being under attack. So it's not just Judaism, but we've certainly seen it in mosques, and we've also seen it in Christian churches as well. But I think it's that education and changing the mindset of people. And by doing that through universities, doing that through schools, I think that makes a change into people's attitudes to make them more tolerant.
And lastly, Where do you stand on the Holocaust Memorial and Educational Centre, which is to be built in the heart of Westminster, costing, the government's giving up 75 million, maybe they'll find another 25 million, some of it's been spent, as we heard earlier on from Baroness Deech. Where do you stand on it? Is it a good thing or not?
I think it's certainly a good thing. I'm very supportive. I think it's a good location. It's by Parliament. It's certainly within Westminster, and I think that's important. It's clearly to be seen as part of the cultural heritage of England and London, and I like that as well. And I have to say, I've just got to say, I was in Berlin a couple of years ago, and I found it so ironic to be at the Holocaust Memorial, very nearby where we believe that Hitler's bunker was. And I found a great sense of satisfaction to know it was so close to what was the Nazi seat of power. And I'm very pleased that our Holocaust Memorial Centre will be at our seat of power as well.
Matthew Offord, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We will have questions from the audience, and to organise that, let me hand back to Gary Mond.
Thank you very much, James, for that comprehensive interview. The one issue that I'm going to ask the first question, and if you are asked on the doorstep, what are the government's current plans with regards to trying to deal with anti-Semitism? And also, what other plans should the government have to try to deal with anti-Semitism? How would you answer?
How would I answer that? Well, I mentioned what the government's doing in terms of spending, but the Department for Levelling Up Communities and Housing, Michael Gove's department, are publishing a hate crime action plan. And that certainly will challenge some of the prejudice and behaviour and allow people to report hate crimes as they see them. So that doesn't just have to be the Jewish community, but it means that we can get a sense of the extent of behaviours. And as such, we can use that to focus upon different mechanisms to prevent anti-Semitism and indeed Islamophobia as well. So there's something that Michael Gove's particularly keen on working with. And as I said, I think we could work that within our schools to address the issue and let people understand that anti-Semitism is a real issue and it's a real problem in some parts of the country, more so in some than the others. But we can address that by particularly working with younger people.
Thank you. We've got three questions. I'm going to ask first Johnny Taylor, then Ruth Hart, then Joe Silver. Johnny. You're on mute, Johnny. Come off mute. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Matthew, for a wonderful survey of what you're doing. And of course, we support you in everything you do. I am very interested to hear about the coming up report of the program called Prevent, which I understand is going to be severely criticized in the near future. Yeah. And there's a lot of difficult issues which are going to be addressed. Hopefully, a lot of it is to do with political correctness. If I'm not wrong, right. How do you see that the Prevent program, which up to now has not been terribly successful, it's been widely acknowledged it hasn't been successful. How do you see it changing to make it become much more relevant to the demographic issue which we have in our society today?
I think you hit the nail on the head. And again, it's not a case of being outspoken, but I think we need to actually address issues. We've had the problem of the Rotherham sex gangs, where the police and indeed social service were afraid to say anything because they believed that they'd be tarnished as being racist. And clearly they were not being racist. They were addressing a crime. It just happened to be committed by a certain group of people from a particular ethnic group. Now, not all people in that ethnic group behave in such a way. So that behavior should have been called out much earlier. And it's the same with the Prevent program. We know that when people express views, for example, let's say about Israel, criticism of Israel is justified, but to conflate Judaism and Israel is not. So we know the subtle differences. And I think we need to call that out, and the Prevent program needs to identify that, make it very clear what is acceptable and what is not, and to take the appropriate action when we see people behaving in our society in the ways that contravenes that. And we need to empower, I think, social workers and teachers to speak out and to make their voices very clear when they see a problem in the community. And they should not be fearful of being decried as a racist, because we all have to talk about difficult issues. But I think we do that with a sense of proportion and we're certainly careful of our language, that we can do that. And the Prevent programme must be seen to do that.
Thank you very much. Ruth Hart, then Joe Silver, then Steve Winston. Ruth, you're on mute. Okay.
Good evening, Matthew. Just before you were here, and I think this is why James asked the question, Baroness Deech gave her opinion on the prospective Holocaust Memorial, and unfortunately, she said that we've had a number of projects which are meant to educate young people. We have several memorial museums, but they appear not to be making a great deal of difference. Some of these same teenagers and students, they have visited the museums, they have had these courses in school, and then they still go on to be advocates for hatred of Jews. Would that change your opinion of a prospective, yet another memorial?
No, I don't think it would. Well, it does not change my opinion. Because it's not just young people, it's also older people who certainly not only speak with their children and their relatives and friends, but also will, if they have a view that was challenged by the Holocaust Memorial Centre to show them that there was this terrible incident that happened. I think that changes the tenor of the conversation as it happens in society. So when people are young, they say silly things. They also joke about issues such as death because it seems so remote to them. And it's only when we get older that we start to realise that life is a bit more serious, and issues such as the Holocaust did happen and could happen again. And we've seen in places like Rwanda and Bosnia where it has happened, and indeed China. And so I think it's not just younger people who will benefit from it. It's those that accompany them or those that visit them who take part in the conversations in society. So I think that would be a good reason for many people to learn more about the Holocaust and to recognise how societies can very quickly tip over the edge into a terrible situation that it was.
Joe Silver. Joe, you're still on mute.
Right, okay.
Okay, that's better.
Thank you. Hello, Matthew. I don't think I've ever met you, but I think your knowledge is very impressive.
That's kind.
And I would just like to say on a personal note here, where you might have got some of your feelings for Israel on. You see, I knew your father very well and your family, because I went to school with them, with my sisters and brothers. And I can tell you it was a difficult time as being the only Jews in the town. I won't say where that was, but we always got a full support from your family, and we thank you for that.
That's kind.
And, I think that's very important to have said that as well. I think I could just say that a word in Hebrew, which is kadima, which is keep going forward, Matthew. Mazel tov.
Thank you. That's really kind. I appreciate it a great deal. Thank you.
Okay, Steve Winston.
Thanks, Gary, and hi, Matthew. Good evening.
Hi.
Matthew, you have been a very active participant at many of the pro-Israel community's counter efforts against the annual Al-Quds parade. As an MP, and bearing in mind this annual hate fest is, still happens, do you think there's any traction to be had by campaigning for driving this annual hate fest? That's all it can be called.
Yes.
Do you think there's any traction in campaigning for it being removed from the streets?
Yes, is the answer. As you say, it is just a completely unpleasant event that occurs each year. And I certainly would like to see it ended. All it does is bring problems. It was most distressful after the Grenfell Tower when all the public services in London were stretched, the police, the fire brigade, including the ambulance service. And still they decided to go ahead with it, and it caused so many problems for the police. For that reason alone, I certainly think it should. I'm not into banning things, but I just don't think it's necessary in this day and age. It really is unpleasant. I think it brings out individuals who are particularly unpleasant to others. And as you say, it promotes a hatred. And that is not the way that we are going to find a solution to the Middle East issue, by having an annual protest like that. And sometimes people say to me, well, clearly you're so pro-Israeli, you hate the Palestinians. I do not hate the Palestinians at all. I dislike Hamas and Hezbollah particularly. And to see Hezbollah flags flying in the past, that was just too much. And I remember going to a demonstration at Number 10 and saying to the police, can I speak to the Gold Commander? And when he came out, I had a copy of the Terrorism Act 2000 pointing out that this organisation was banned. And I understand at the time they were trying to keep peoples apart, but I'm pleased that it took a lot of pressure. And I remember arguing with the current Defence Secretary on the floor of the House about the banning of Hezbollah. And then one day it was simply decided that it was going to be banned. And I was pretty pleased about that.
Okay.
And thanks for all your help, all your efforts and the work you do with members of Parliament.
Thank you. Excellent. Rosie and Carol, you keep waving your hand. Please, could you put your hand up digitally? I've directed you how to do that. You go to reactions, you click on reactions, and you see that there's a button there which enables you to raise your hand rather than just waving it in the air. Rosie. Rosie, you're on mute.
Mute, okay.
Right, it's fine now.
Right. First of all, I just want to thank you and pay tribute to this government and the Conservative government at the moment. It's been a very long time. We've had such a pro-Israel, pro-Jewish government, and particularly also from the ethnic members of the cabinet. I think they're fantastic.
Yes.
In that, just 2 points. I can't agree with you about criticism of Israel, because when they say criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic, invariably the criticism are things that nobody else is criticized for, where Israel's being singled out, like for the simple defense of its people. And I also would take a slight issue that actually Israel is intrinsic to the Jewish faith. But that's another thing. I just wonder, just one point, I'm just amazed that after so many years and with all our representative bodies, the Board of Deputies, etc., that Israel Apartheid Week still takes place on our campuses. It's an obscenity and it's an incitement to racial hatred. And I just wonder why within the law this cannot be stopped, because it's certainly not free speech. Thank you.
That is a good point. And again, it's an issue that I raise regularly every year as we lead up to it. And I'm pleased that some universities don't allow it because, first of all, I think it does a great disservice to the people of South Africa who lived under an apartheid regime. And when you consider the Knesset and the people who are elected to the Knesset, you recognize that there are people who are from the Arab community, there are people of no religion, people from the Orthodox community. And so to call it an apartheid state is more than a great disservice. As I said, it's something that the universities minister, Michelle Donovan, has been very good on. She has argued for the definition of anti-Semitism to be recognised by universities. And I've asked about withholding funding from those that don't recognise it. I think it's probably something on her agenda, and I'd be very keen to continue to push that. But anything that instigates or is instrumental in providing hatred against students who may support the state of Israel is simply unacceptable. And the universities and their vice chancellors must step in to prevent that from happening. And again, we've had some success at Middlesex University. We've started it a couple of times, but they're so terrified of being told that they are prejudicing one community against another by not allowing so-called free speech. But we have a situation now where free speech seems to be you must agree with each other, or you must agree with a certain point of view, whether it's about sexuality, transgender rights, Israel, or a host of other issues. And universities are always about ideas and challenging ideas, not just having an idea and saying, well, this is it. No one else can disagree with that because I find great offence to it. And I certainly would be keen to keep advocating that we get rid of Apartheid Week, because there's many other regimes around the world, be it Iran, be it China, be it lots of other countries that repress their people, and no one ever talks about those.
Thank you. Carol Cohen. Carol, you're on mute. Would you come off mute, please? Carol Cohen, you are on mute. Please come off mute. Not sure what's happening here. James, James isn't there. So you're still on mute, Carol. Does anyone else want to ask a question? We've got like just a few minutes left. If not, sorry, he's still on mute. I don't quite know.
No, he's unmuted now.
I'm all yours.
There you are. Okay, Carol.
I regain my voice. Mr. Offord, we met once or twice at the House of Commons, some other events, and with great pleasure. I would like to, first of all, to state something to define you, yourself, and what you are doing. You may not be aware, but I would attach to you the epithet of Hasid Olam, or righteous among Gentiles, among nations. You belong to a very small group, an elite group of Gentiles of all persuasions, many Christians, Sikhs, Muslims, but dedicated, devoted friends and supporters of Israel and Jewish people. You do not, you and people like yourself, do not need any persuasion, any bribing, any hasbara or explanation. It's all there. It's inside yourself. The other gentleman mentioned that he knew your father and so on. It's there, you inherited there. And we want to acknowledge you, all of you. There are few people in the media, in broadcasting, in politics, historians, remarkable people. And we, Jewish people, we notice your contribution, your fantastic deal of dedication to Jewish causes and to Israel. We want to thank you. And I want to mention to you, thank you for being Matthew Offord. And I wish you well.
Well, that's very kind. I think perhaps that phrase will go to my head a little bit, but I do what I think is right. And that is exactly what I do. And I'm very pleased to be in a position where I can do that as a member of Parliament. And long may that continue. So thank you. That's very kind of you.
Right. Ruth Hart, or is it Paul Hart? The last question. Could you come off mute, please? You're on mute, Paul.
Yes, I know. Hi, Matthew. Nice to see you again.
Hi.
Correct me if I'm wrong, has there been legislation against the BDS movement? And if so, what shape is it going to take?
My recollection is it's currently working its way through Parliament. I don't believe we've had second reading yet, but I think, I'm not sure if we've had the bill published yet, but we certainly are working to ensure that local authorities, anyone in the public services, does not engage in the BDS movement, and so they don't create their own unofficial foreign policy. Foreign policy is something that's in the gift of the United Kingdom Parliament and not other organisations. So we're very keen to ensure that. I speak out on the BDS because it discriminates against particularly Palestinians. You look at the SodaStream factory, for example, people who work there were being paid a higher rate of salaries than other people in the West Bank. And when all the criticism emerged them, a lot of people lost their employment. And that's counterproductive, certainly against good agreements of coexistence amongst peoples. And it's just self-defeating. So we are stopping local authorities and other organisations from doing that. And I'm very, very pleased that the government have done that, and they've been very keen to do so. Yes.
Well, thank you very much, James, for interviewing. Thank you, everyone, for asking Matthew questions. It just remains for me to thank Matthew very much for giving up his evening. I believe you were supposed to be in Estonia, and it was going to be 11:15 at night, and you'd be signing in from the bar, but apparently that was cancelled. So you are in the UK.
That was.
Yeah.
That was, but we were voting. We had a couple of votes tonight. We're expecting a few more, so it was a bit of a dash to get home. But I look forward to having some dinner now. But can I thank the NJA and congratulate and wish you Mazel Tov upon your establishment. and you've established yourself well. And I look forward to not only engaging with you in the future, but also discussing issues of mutual concern between ourselves.
Thank you so much for your time, Matthew. It was very good of you to give up your evening and to answer so many questions. And that brings the evening to an end. So can I thank everyone? It's pretty well bang on 10 o'clock, as I predicted. So can I thank everyone for joining us tonight? I hope you found it enjoyable. I will be circulating everybody with the next meeting. It might be in 4 weeks' time or a tiny bit later. We're just going to finalise things with speakers, and you will be informed about the next advisory. The next meeting with guest speakers. Thank you so much for coming. Good night.
Good night, all.
Good night.